You reached everything you wanted and lost the person who wanted it. There's a silence that comes after success, a kind you don't expect. It's not peace. It's not relief. It's disorientation. You did everything right. You followed the path, hit the milestones, chased the dream with a kind of disciplined desperation. And now that you're here, at the top, or close enough to smell it, something feels off. Wrong, even. But not just wrong in the way a misstep feels wrong. Wrong in the way a fundamental lie begins to unravel. This wasn't how it was supposed to feel. You were promised satisfaction. You were promised identity. You were promised that success would confirm something essential about you. That you are valuable. That you are enough. That you are real. But success didn't give you any of that. Instead, it gave you distance. From others. From yourself. From meaning. You don't feel like you won. You feel like you lost something invisible. And you can't quite point to when it happened. But the hollow space where you used to be is impossible to ignore. You start tracing it back. At first, success was just a goal. A light in the distance. It pulled you forward. You wanted to become something better. You wanted to escape something. Maybe mediocrity. Maybe shame. Maybe invisibility. But as you moved forward, the cost kept rising. You let go of hobbies, rest, relationships. You compromised values, trimmed emotions, edited your personality. Not all at once, just enough to optimize, to streamline, to compete. And every time you performed well, you were rewarded. Praise, approval, advancement. You learned quickly that being authentic wasn't nearly as effective as being impressive. So you became impressive. You became efficient, strategic, focused. You learned how to say the right things, how to present, how to adjust your tone, how to be admired. And little by little, the person you were performing started to replace the person you actually were. The problem wasn't that you were lying. The problem was that the lie started to work. You succeeded. And with every win, the original version of you became harder to access. Not because she died, but because you stopped visiting her. Because success made you too busy to remember what you looked like before you put on the mask. And now you can't take it off. You've arrived wherever there was, and people envy you. They say they want what you have. They ask for advice. They call you inspiring. But when you wake up in the middle of the night, you don't feel inspired. You feel erased. You feel like a story that's still being told by someone who forgot the ending, or maybe someone who never knew it. Here's the part no one says out loud. Success can quietly reprogram your sense of self, not through trauma, not through failure, but through subtle, consistent reinforcement of the wrong rewards. It tells you that your worth is measurable, scalable, sellable, that your value rises when your metrics do. That becoming better means becoming more efficient, more polished, more marketable. And the worst part is, you believed it. Because it worked. You got results. You made it. But something else got lost in the transaction. The ability to recognize yourself without the context of achievement. Who are you when no one is watching? When you're not producing, not performing, not proving anything? If that question makes your chest tighten, you're not alone. Because maybe this wasn't success. Maybe this was obedience, disguised as progress. You followed the system, but the system was never designed to make you whole. It was designed to make you useful. And when you're no longer useful, you begin to feel disposable, even to yourself. The praise you receive doesn't land anymore. It hits the surface like rain on glass, noticed, but never absorbed. You smile because you're supposed to. You celebrate because you should. But inside, there's a quiet implosion, a soft dread that whispers, this isn't it. This was never it. And now you're trapped in a paradox. To keep the life you built, you must keep being the version of you who built it. But that version is tired, unrecognizable, sometimes even unbearable. And if you try to stop, to walk away, to return to something more real, what will be left? What relationships survived the climb? What joys weren't turned into content? What parts of you still function without being optimized for performance? People romanticize the hustle. They worship the grind. But they never talk about the existential collapse on the other side of it. The quiet psychological violence of achieving everything and still feeling fractured. Or worse, feeling nothing. And so you distract yourself. You upgrade goals. You add more responsibilities. You take on new projects. Because if you stay in motion, maybe you won't notice the stillness inside you, the one that feels like decay, the one that asks hard questions with no good answers. Like, what if all of this wasn't for you? What if the dream was inherited, not chosen? What if you never wanted this life, but just got good at wanting it because others said you should? These questions aren't just uncomfortable. They're destabilizing. They rip through the foundation of your identity. Because if you remove success, what's left? If the identity you built was always conditional, always transactional, then who are you when no one needs anything from you? You don't know. And that not knowing isn't freeing. It's terrifying. There are people who never question this, who ride the high of achievement straight through life. They never pause long enough to hear the silence beneath the applause. But you did. You paused. You heard it. And now you can't unhear it. The worst part, there's no obvious villain, no trauma to blame, just a slow, quiet replacement of your inner compass with a social algorithm, one that rewards visibility over intimacy, metrics over meaning, outcomes over presence. You weren't destroyed in one blow. You were gradually sculpted into someone else until the original shape disappeared. So what now? You could keep going. Keep performing. Keep collecting external validation to fill the void. But you already know it won't work. The high fades. The applause quiets. The numbers blur. And you're left with the same question. Why do I feel less real every time I win? Or you could stop. Not quit. Not collapse. Just stop. Stop pretending this feels good. Stop acting like this version of you is whole. Stop lying to yourself for the comfort of others. And maybe, just maybe, begin to reconstruct the self that success asked you to abandon. Not to burn it all down, but to recover what got buried in the pursuit. This isn't a redemption story. Not yet. This is the part where you stare into the mirror and realize you've been performing so long. You don't remember the sound of your real voice. And it's going to take time, maybe years, to find it again. But here's what's certain. If you keep letting success define you, it will keep destroying you. Quietly, elegantly, irreversibly. Because some victories don't make you stronger. They just make you strangers to yourself. You became who they admired, not who you are. Success rarely asks who you are. It only asks what you can do, what you can prove, what you can offer. And in your desperation to answer those questions, you stopped asking your own. Who am I becoming? What do I actually want? What part of me is real? You were told success would set you free, that it would validate your existence, that if you just achieved enough, became smart enough, driven enough, charismatic enough, then the world would give you permission to exist without apology. But what success actually gave you was a script, a role, a performance, one that demanded consistency, excellence, discipline, and confidence, even when none of those things came naturally, even when they cost you your authenticity. Because in the beginning, you weren't performing, you were exploring, learning, creating, trying. There was curiosity in you. There was experimentation. There was a softness that hadn't yet been coded in ambition. You weren't trying to be anything. You just were. Messy, raw, present. But the moment someone praised you, something changed. That praise became a mirror, a new way of seeing yourself. And just like that, you weren't exploring anymore. You were curating, editing, performing. You began to become the version of yourself that others found impressive. You began to mold your personality to the reaction you received. If they liked your confidence, you amplified it. If they admired your productivity, you doubled it. If they respected your logic, you muted your emotion. Slowly, without noticing, you abandoned the parts of yourself that didn't fit the character. You stopped asking if the person they admired was someone you liked. You only cared that they admired her. That's how it starts. You say yes to things that feel wrong because they lead to recognition. You fake energy you don't have. You hide vulnerability that doesn't align with the image. And over time, you forget which parts were real and which were designed. You forget where the mask ends and you begin. And the world doesn't help. It rewards performance. It rewards consistency. It punishes introspection. The moment you try to break character, to say no, to pause, to rest, to admit confusion, people panic. They look at you like you're malfunctioning, like you're letting them down, like you've become unreliable. And so you push through. You hold the character in place, not because it feels good, but because unraveling now feels dangerous. But something inside you is breaking. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's quiet erosion, a kind of emotional dry rot. You're still functioning, still posting, still attending. But inside, there's a growing emptiness, a sickening awareness that you're succeeding at being someone who doesn't feel like you anymore. And the worst part, you're praised for it. You're celebrated for your discipline, your excellence, your reliability. But none of them know what it's costing you. None of them know that behind the flawless presentation is a person who feels like a hollow container, valuable only when full of something impressive. You lie awake at night wondering what it would feel like to stop, to disappoint them all, to stop managing their expectations, to stop performing the version of you that gets clapped for. But the thought terrifies you, because if you stop being admired, who will you be? And if you're not admired, will anyone stay? You didn't realize how deeply the performance had rooted itself. How many decisions were being made by fear, not freedom. You thought you were building a future. You were building a prison, one shaped like your ideal self. And the irony is brutal. The more people love the person you're pretending to be, the more it confirms that your real self was never enough. That's what they don't tell you about success. It doesn't always kill your insecurities. Sometimes, it weaponizes them, turns them into tools for achievement. Your fear of being unwanted becomes motivation. Your need to prove yourself becomes branding. Your childhood wounds become stories for TED Talks. You become functional, powerful, marketable, but not whole. You stand in rooms full of people and feel alone, not because they don't like you, but because they don't see you. They see the version you curated, the one who always knows what to say, who always looks like she's thriving, who never lets her mask slip, even when she's choking underneath it. You laugh when expected. You show up when asked. You nod in meetings. You give the speech. You crush the deadline. And everyone thinks you're strong. They call you a role model, a leader, a success story. But none of them ask if you're okay. And if they did, you wouldn't know how to answer. Because what would you say? I don't know who I am anymore. I've become a stranger to myself. I feel like an echo of a person I used to love. You don't say those things. You say, I'm just tired. You say, busy season. You say, I'll take a break soon. But you know you won't. Because stepping off the stage means revealing how deep the fracture runs. And you're not sure you could survive that kind of exposure. So you keep going. And in quiet moments, you wonder, what would happen if I stopped being impressive? Would anyone still stay? Would anyone still see me as worthy? Or would I vanish? You realize how little of your worth is grounded in being. It's all in doing, producing, delivering, performing. There is no room for simply existing, no space for confusion, no tolerance for contradiction. So you keep becoming who they admire, because being who you are feels dangerous, because success trained you to believe that being yourself is a liability. You're not thriving, you're disappearing, and the applause only makes it worse, because it confirms the lie. that this is who you're supposed to be, that the character is the truth, that the image is the identity. And maybe it's too late. Maybe the version of you that once felt whole is too far gone. Maybe she's not coming back. Or maybe she's still there. Faint, quiet, waiting for you to stop performing long enough to hear her. If this content resonates with you, and you'd like to see more of these quiet, honest explorations, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps more than you know, and it reminds us both that the unspoken parts matter too. But you won't hear her if you keep chasing admiration, if you keep mistaking applause for love, if you keep confusing productivity for purpose. One day, you'll look in the mirror and not recognize the face staring back, not because it changed, but because you've been avoiding it for too long. That's when you'll understand. You became someone worth admiring, but not someone you recognize. And that's a success that feels like loss. You chased success to escape yourself and took the problem with you. There are two reasons people chase success. One is desire. The other is escape. Desire says, I want more. Escape says, I can't stand where I am. And the tragedy is, they often look the same on the surface. Both push you to achieve. Both motivate action. But only one is rooted in freedom. The other is rooted in fear. And when your ambition is built on fear, fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of confronting who you are, it doesn't matter how far you go. Because no matter what you build, you're still running. That's the part no one talks about. We celebrate ambition. We idolize drive. But we don't ask what people are running from. We don't ask why someone needs to win so badly. Why they grind, obsess, sacrifice. Why they can't stop, even when they're exhausted, even when they're already ahead. It's not hunger. It's avoidance. A compulsive need to never sit still. Because stillness means feeling. And feeling means facing. And facing means confronting something you don't know how to fix. Maybe it's shame. Maybe it's loneliness. Maybe it's the quiet belief that you're not enough and never will be. But whatever it is, it lives inside you. And success won't cure it. It just distracts you from it. For a while, you tell yourself you're building a better life, that you're being productive, focused, purpose-driven. But beneath that, what you're really doing is hiding, using success as a disguise, hoping that if you look impressive enough, if you achieve enough, if you stay busy enough, no one, not even you, will notice the thing rotting beneath the surface. And for a while, it works. The world rewards you. You become the hard worker, the overachiever, the unstoppable one. People admire your drive. They don't see the panic behind it, the quiet desperation, the nights you lie awake wondering if you'll ever feel okay just being who you are. You don't rest, not because you love the grind, but because rest is dangerous. In stillness, the voice gets louder, the one that says you're a fraud, that you're unlovable, that you're only valuable when you're useful. You don't slow down because slowing down means listening, and you already know what it will say. So you keep running, faster, harder. You climb, you build, you win, and with each win, you expect relief. You expect to feel healed, whole, safe, but it doesn't come. The victories are temporary, like numbing agents. They wear off quickly, and then the anxiety returns, more urgent than before. You were never chasing goals. You were running from yourself. And that's why success feels empty, because it wasn't built from a place of alignment. It was built from a place of fear. You didn't become someone new. You just added layers, disguises, titles, distractions. You never addressed the root. You just learned how to perform around it. You moved to a new city, but the emptiness followed. You got a new job, but the dread remained. You got in shape, got followers, got offers, and still, the same question haunted you. Why do I feel like this? Because you can't outrun yourself. That's the truth most people never face. Because it's too destabilizing. They'd rather build a life around the pain than risk collapsing the structure. They'd rather decorate the prison than tear it down. You tell yourself, once I reach this next goal, it'll get better. Once I get promoted, once I buy the house, once I make this much money. But every time you get there, the high fades. The satisfaction is shallow. And the problem, the real one, is still there, waiting, because it was never about the goal. It was about not knowing how to sit with your own mind, not knowing how to be enough when there's nothing to prove. And the longer you run, the more success becomes a mask for pain. That's why it destroys you quietly. Because from the outside, you look fine. You look great. Even. People admire you. You get awards. You're seen as stable, competent, successful. But inside, there's chaos. An identity that was never formed, only performed. A person who doesn't know how to rest without guilt. Who doesn't know how to feel proud without performance. And eventually, it catches up to you. You hit a wall. Maybe it's burnout. Maybe it's a panic attack. Maybe it's the sudden realization that your life is full, but you are not. That you've filled your calendar but emptied your sense of meaning. That you've achieved everything except peace. This is the part no one wants to reach, because it feels like failure. Like all the effort was for nothing. Like the foundation is crumbling. But it's not failure. It's the first honest moment you've had in years. Because now, finally, you're forced to face what success helped you avoid. You're forced to ask, what have I been running from? And more importantly, who am I when I stop running? Those questions are brutal. They're humiliating. They strip away the image. They reveal the emotional rawness you buried under a decade of effort. But they're also necessary. Because the only way to heal is to stop pretending that success ever made you whole. It didn't. It distracted you from the parts of you that were screaming for attention. Now you have to listen. Maybe that voice says you never felt seen, that your achievements were a cry for acknowledgement. Maybe it says you've never really believed you deserve love unless you're useful. Maybe it says your entire identity is built on fear of being forgotten. Whatever it says, it's telling the truth you couldn't face before. And now, you have a choice. You can go back to running. Pretend this was just a bad week. Get more sleep. Push harder. Reset your goals. You know how to do that. It's familiar. Or you can stop. You can sit with the discomfort. You can peel back the layers and ask who you really are beneath the ambition. You can start over, not from a place of lack, but from a place of honesty. You can choose to build something real this time. But that will cost you everything the old version of you depended on. The image, the certainty, the rush, the praise. And that's why most people don't do it. Because they're not just afraid of failure. They're afraid of being seen without their mask. But maybe that's where healing begins. Not when you win, but when you finally stop trying to escape the one thing you've never let yourself love, yourself. You built a life you can't feel anymore. And that fortress? It's not safety. It's isolation. You didn't realize it while building it, because you thought you were making something strong, something reliable, something that would protect you. And in many ways, it did. It protected you from chaos, from vulnerability, from being unprepared. But it also protected you from connection, from surprise, from wonder. You live behind the walls now. You manage instead of experience. You organize instead of engage. Every part of your life has become a function of something else. And without realizing it, you've built a system so efficient that it has no room for being alive in the way you were before. Because feeling is inconvenient. It breaks structure. It slows things down. It makes you irrational, unproductive, distracted. At least, that's what the voice in your head says. The one you absorbed from school, from work, from a society that rewards only the visible and measurable. And you believed it. So you cut away the parts of your life that didn't serve the outcome. You stopped making art unless it had a purpose. You stopped going outside unless it fit your schedule. You stopped calling people unless there was something to say. You even learned how to suppress your own excitement, because being too emotional could make people uncomfortable. You never named it. But what you were doing was anesthetizing yourself. Not because you were weak, but because it was rewarded. You were praised for your control, your discipline, your focus. But underneath all that structure, you were slowly separating yourself from the world you live in. You see beauty, but you don't feel moved by it. You hear music, but you don't sing along anymore. You remember joy, but you can't access it on demand. And this isn't depression. That would be easier to diagnose, easier to explain. This is something quieter, a slow fading of your emotional signal. The lights are still on, but no one's home. You try to fix it the only way you know how. More systems, more goals, more refinement. You think maybe if you get more organized, wake up earlier, fix your sleep, hit new performance benchmarks, it'll come back. The feeling, the spark. But you can't organize your way back into yourself, because the problem wasn't chaos. It was disconnection, a widening gap between who you are and who your life expects you to be. And no amount of efficiency can close that gap. What can? Relearning how to be with yourself, without judgment, without a plan, without needing it to produce something. But that's terrifying, because what if, when you slow down, you discover you don't like what's left? What if there's nothing inside but confusion, or worse, regret? And so most people stay busy, not because they love it, but because it keeps them safe from themselves. The irony is brutal. You built your life to feel secure, and now you feel nothing. You built your life to be admired, and now you feel unknown. You built your life to be proud of, and now you can't even tell if you care. Because it turns out, the human heart doesn't respond to productivity. It responds to presence, to awe, to contradiction, to tension, to moments that don't fit on a spreadsheet. The problem isn't that you failed. It's that you succeeded and still lost the connection. You built the life, but you're not in it anymore. You're managing it, maintaining it, optimizing it, but you're not living it. And maybe you didn't know any other way. Maybe you were taught that success was the goal, and feeling would follow. That if you just achieved enough, the emotions would come back online. The joy, the gratitude, the meaning. But it doesn't work that way. Feelings don't return just because you made it. They return when they're invited, when they're welcomed, even when inconvenient, when you stop measuring them, when you stop turning them into content, when you stop asking them to justify themselves. So what now? It won't be fixed by a new app, or a better planner, or another book. It begins by remembering how to feel without framing, how to exist without editing, how to sit in silence without reaching for a distraction. It starts with letting your guard down for long enough to remember what it feels like to be surprised by your own laughter, to cry without knowing why, to listen to music and let it wreck you, to walk without a destination, to spend time with someone without trying to impress them. None of this will get you promoted. It won't grow your audience. It won't go viral, but it might give you back your life. Because what you lost wasn't your ambition. It wasn't your edge. It was your access to yourself. And that loss didn't happen all at once. It happened in micro decisions, one numb yes at a time. You can't rebuild that connection overnight, but you can stop making the problem worse. You can stop performing, stop optimizing, stop pretending that function is enough. You didn't fail. You disconnected. And now, you have to learn how to plug back in, not to a system, not to a strategy, but to yourself. Because if you keep living like this, success will not destroy you loudly. It will do it in whispers, through little compromises, through achievements that make no difference, through milestones that feel like blur, until one day you realize you got everything, but you felt none of it. You measured your worth in metrics and forgot how to be human. It started subtly, a progress bar, a follower count, a spreadsheet, a compliment attached to a number. And slowly, without ever deciding to, you began to think of yourself as data, your value measurable, your success quantifiable. Your identity, tracked in real time, one digit at a time. At first, it felt motivating. You had something tangible to chase, something to point to when the self-doubt crept in. If the number was up, you were doing well. If it was down, something was wrong. You didn't need to ask how you felt. You could check a dashboard. But over time, the metrics stopped being feedback and became the goal. You weren't just working hard. You were monitoring, calibrating, optimizing. Your sense of self-worth began to sync with performance indicators you didn't even choose. Likes, views, income, engagement, productivity, milestones. If it could be counted, it mattered. If it couldn't, it faded into the background, irrelevant. And slowly, the unmeasurable parts of your life started to shrink. Moments of silence, unfinished conversations, gut feelings, unstructured curiosity, emotions that didn't translate to output. You stopped investing in what didn't show up on the graph, not because you didn't care, but because you couldn't justify it. You trained your brain to value only what could be tracked. And the worst part, the world applauded you for it. You were efficient. You were focused. You were crushing it. People asked how you stayed on top of everything. They envied your consistency. They didn't see that behind your productivity was a slow erosion of your humanity. Because you stopped being a person. You became a profile, a brand, a system of performance indicators that looked impressive but felt increasingly hollow. You didn't know how to sit still anymore. Not without guilt. Not without the need to explain why stillness was useful. You couldn't rest unless you could prove it made you better later. You couldn't explore unless there was a plan. You couldn't even play unless it served a purpose. You forgot how to be without becoming. And when someone asked how you were, you didn't check in with your feelings. You checked your stats. You scanned your progress. You calculated your recent output and answered accordingly. You weren't lying. You were just using the only measurement system you had left. You replaced your internal compass with external validation. And over time, that compass broke. You didn't know what you enjoyed unless it got results. You didn't know what you believed unless it was affirmed. You didn't know what mattered unless it moved the metrics. And the problem with metrics is that they never stop asking for more. They don't care if you're tired. They don't know if you're grieving. They don't pause for meaning. They only reward increase. And so you kept pushing, not because you wanted more, but because stopping would mean becoming invisible, becoming unmeasured, becoming yourself. You used to be a person who could sit with ambiguity, who didn't need proof to enjoy something, who could be wrong, or bored, or disconnected without panic. But now, every dip in your numbers feels like a personal failure. Every lull in momentum feels like a threat to your existence. And the tragedy is, you were never meant to live like this. You were never meant to evaluate your life through graphs. You were never meant to tie your identity to a quarterly report. You were never meant to reduce your worth to engagement. But you did. Not because you were shallow, but because you were scared. Scared of being forgotten, of not matching, of disappearing in a world that tracks everything. So you gave them something to track. You gave them numbers, wins, consistency. You played the game, and you won. But it cost you the ability to exist without scorekeeping. Now you don't know how to unplug without losing yourself. You don't know how to fail without feeling erased. You don't know how to disconnect without guilt. And that's what success quietly stole from you. Not your joy, not your relationships, not even your health. It stole your unmeasured self. The one who didn't need data to be real. The one who could just be. And until you reclaim that self, every success will be a transaction. Every achievement will be a gamble. Every moment will be weighed against a number that doesn't love you back. Because metrics don't love. They don't hold. They don't care. They measure. And if you let them define your worth, you will spend your life rising and never arriving. You followed the formula, and it replaced you. You can trace the mechanics of the process. You can name the moments where deviation was discouraged, even if no one said it directly. A group meeting where you offered an alternative and were met with silence. A time you expressed hesitation and were told to focus. An instinct you ignored because the numbers pointed elsewhere. One by one, the feedback trained you. You learned that approval comes from predictability. That creativity is tolerated only when it fits inside existing frames. That passion must be framed as productivity. That self-doubt is something to suppress, not examine. So you internalize these lessons, not out of weakness, but out of adaptation, because the system didn't reward honesty. It rewarded alignment. This doesn't just change your behavior. It changes how you process reality. Eventually, you stop noticing your original reactions. You filter your thoughts before they fully form. You anticipate reactions. You rehearse answers. Not because you're deceitful, but because you're efficient. The system made you efficient at one thing, being what it needs, rather than what you are. That process continues quietly in the background. You remain functional. You succeed. But over time, that success feels increasingly detached from meaning. The achievements don't register emotionally. They're observed, not felt. You check boxes. You receive feedback. But the part of you that used to respond, the internal signal that says this matters, has gone silent. You can't remember the last time you pursued something that didn't serve a clear function. You can't remember the last time you made a decision that wasn't filtered through consequences. Not because you're cautious, but because self-protection has become your primary lens. When people say they admire your focus, they don't realize what it's built on. They assume you're disciplined. What they don't see is that you've lost the ability to explore without strategy. That spontaneity now triggers anxiety. That freedom, once desirable, now feels like risk. And when you hear others talk about passion, about meaning, about purpose, you understand the words, but they feel theoretical, like concepts from an earlier version of you that no longer exists. If you were asked to define who you are without referring to your role, your habits, your achievements, you wouldn't know where to begin, because the internal framework has been replaced. The self has become function. The person has become position. This is not burnout. Burnout is a collapse of energy. This is something else. A collapse of reference. A disintegration of the mental link between doing and being. You're still doing, but there's no longer a self clearly connected to it. Only a system operating on momentum. You might try to fix it. You might change jobs, change industries, start a new venture. But unless you change the mental structure, the results repeat. The optimization continues. The formula reasserts itself. You adapt to new expectations, new roles. The shape shifts, but the mechanics remain the same. You're not broken. You're functional. The problem is that functionality replaced identity. That improvement replaced inquiry. That success replaced presence. This is not a crisis of failure. It's a crisis of effectiveness. You were too effective at becoming what was needed. And now that the need has been fulfilled, the original identity, the one that adapted in the first place, is untraceable. The reward structure still operates. You continue receiving signals that you're doing well. Promotions, praise, metrics, but none of them touch anything internal. They don't land. They confirm that you're still performing, but they don't confirm that you're still present. And this is where the psychological dislocation becomes permanent. The part of you that used to evaluate choices from within now defers to the structure. You ask, what would be smart here? What would be strategic? What would reinforce the version of me that works? You no longer ask, what do I want? What do I believe? What does this mean to me? Because those questions have no place in the system that made you. And if you were to start answering them now, the result would not be inspiring. It would be destabilizing. Because the more honestly you answer them, the more distance you create between the self that succeeded and the self that was never invited back. Eventually, You realize there's no single event that caused this. It wasn't a betrayal or a crisis or a turning point. It was incremental. It happened every time you made the slightly more efficient choice. Every time you aligned just a little closer to the expectations. Every time you edited yourself slightly more sharply. Each of those changes made sense. They were reasonable, logical, justifiable, until the cumulative effect became irreversible. What remains now is a structure that operates, a life that functions, a person who performs. But if you remove the responsibilities, the goals, the audiences, there would be nothing underneath. No internal architecture, no remaining curiosity, just silence, clean, professional, optimized silence. And this, you begin to see, is what success can quietly do. It doesn't just ask you to grow. It asks you to conform. And the danger is not in the request. It's in how easy it is to obey. Because when it's working, when you're winning, the last thing you want to do is stop and ask what it's costing you. You became the evidence that the wrong system works. This kind of role, being the model case, is difficult to exit. Not because it's locked by force, but because it creates an illusion of balance. The system doesn't appear broken as long as you function. The metrics appear justified as long as your output remains stable. Any suggestion of harm becomes anecdotal. And you've already disproved it, simply by continuing. Your performance becomes the currency that invalidates objection, not through argument, but through presence. As long as someone is succeeding within the rules don't seem unreasonable. That's the logic. That's the trap. Your life begins to serve a rhetorical function, and the longer you stay inside it, the harder it becomes to tell whether you're complicit or just efficient, whether you've accepted the terms, or whether they've simply stopped being visible. When something is reinforced consistently enough, it stops appearing structural. It starts looking natural. So you move forward, not because you agree, not because you believe, but because reversing direction would require more than honesty. It would require interruption, a withdrawal of performance, a break from expectation, and that break would create damage, not just to your role, but to the structure that now uses you as proof. That's what keeps most people silent. Not fear of punishment, but fear of contradiction. If you leave, if you falter, you unwrite your own success. You imply that the story was never true. You call into question the metrics that once defined you, and that kind of undoing is rarely welcomed. The pressure to remain becomes internalized. The external reward system no longer needs to monitor you. You monitor yourself. You anticipate disruption. You regulate your behavior in ways that preserve the architecture. You reinforce the environment even as it quietly hollows you out. This isn't visible to most people. They see your discipline, your clarity, your confidence. They see the attributes the system has rewarded, but they don't see the cost. They don't ask whether the foundation is stable, because there is no incentive to ask. That's the mechanism. A flawed structure uses surviving individuals as evidence of its success, while obscuring what had to be amputated for survival to occur. It doesn't matter if your personal life collapsed, if your sense of meaning eroded, if your internal signals dulled to the point of silence. As long as the results continue, the structure remains unchallenged. In many environments, this logic is institutionalized. Corporate settings, academic spaces, performance-based industries all reward figures who exceed thresholds while ignoring how those thresholds are constructed. You're expected to demonstrate output, not examine the cost. You're expected to produce, not reflect. And any attempt to slow down is framed as deviation. The more visible your success, the more pressure you carry. You are asked to mentor, to advise, to replicate your process for others. But the process you followed was not generalizable. It was tailored to an environment optimized for extraction. What worked for you doesn't scale without damage, but that damage will not appear immediately. It will appear downstream. In others, in people who do not share your coping mechanisms. And when they fail, their failure will be attributed to individual weakness, not systemic misalignment. This is how the cycle perpetuates itself, by converting outliers into representatives, by turning isolated success into normative expectation, by interpreting statistical noise as structural proof. There is no reward for stepping back and saying, "This didn't work the way it looks." There is no recognition for identifying yourself as an exception. Once you've been used as a template, any deviation is seen as decline, not as truth. If you burn out, it will be treated as collapse, not as information. If you change direction, it will be reframed as loss, not as correction. The system is not built to receive your retraction, so most people never offer one. They stay. They maintain performance. They adjust expectations. They tell themselves the discomfort is temporary, that things will make sense later, that the feeling of disconnection is just a phase. But the phase becomes a pattern, and the pattern becomes permanent. At some point, you stop remembering what alignment felt like. You no longer track how far you've moved from your internal center, because that center is no longer consulted. It has been replaced by feedback. You function as long as you are rewarded, but there is no anchor. There is no baseline, only activity. And that activity is mistaken for meaning. Eventually, you reach a point where everything works. The schedule is optimized. The systems are in place. The output is stable. But when asked why it matters, you have no answer. The only answer is that it continues. And that continuation, once enough, begins to feel hollow. But it's too late to question it openly. The structure is built. The role is fixed. And the evidence, your results, your presence, is being used. So you stay, not because it's meaningful, but because extraction is too expensive, because revision would require disassembly, because to undo your image is to admit that the image was constructed. And most systems don't tolerate the admission that they were built on misinterpretation. You are the interpretation. And now, even your silence speaks for them. You lost the ability to choose without being told what to want. There is a specific kind of erosion that occurs when you succeed repeatedly in systems that reward external alignment. It doesn't feel like damage. It feels like efficiency. You become better at following frameworks, adopting strategies, conforming to what is effective. At first, this seems like skill, adaptability, responsiveness. But eventually, it leads to something else. The gradual collapse of your ability to choose without input. The longer you operate inside environments that reward clear paths, the more your internal compass is overridden. Not by force, but by substitution. You begin to prioritize what gets results. You defer to trends. You replicate what has worked. You consume more content than you generate intention. And with time, your sense of personal direction becomes indistinguishable from the systems you're navigating. This process is not obvious. You don't wake up one day without preferences. You just notice that. Increasingly, your choices are reactive. What you pursue is defined by external cues. What you build is influenced by market data. What you desire is shaped by demand, not interest. Eventually, initiative becomes impossible without reference. This is the hidden cost of long-term success in systems that prioritize response over authorship. They reward execution, not inquiry. And the more responsive you become, the more disconnected you are from any original signal of desire. Ask yourself a basic question. If no one suggested what to do next, what would you do? For most people operating at high levels of external success, this question produces silence, not reflection, not discomfort, just a blank space. There is no answer because there is no recent history of making decisions without external validation. The system has trained you to look outward before acting, to check if the move is aligned with best practices, if it has precedent, if it's visible. if it's legible. In this framework, desire is not a starting point. It is a liability. You begin to see this in your downtime. When no one is watching, and no task is assigned, you default to consumption. You scroll. You refresh. You watch others act and wait for something to register as relevant. The idea of acting without instruction feels wasteful. Or worse, unproductive. You become uncomfortable with unstructured thought. The irony is that from the outside, you appear decisive, clear-headed, strategic. But from the inside, every decision is contingent. Every move is referenced. You don't act because of internal alignment. You act because the data supports it, because the environment demands it, because someone you follow did it first. You no longer initiate. You react. Even when it looks like leadership, what you are doing is replication. Modified, refined, stylized, but still derivative. And over time, the recognition you receive becomes less satisfying because you know, privately, that the choices were not authored. They were selected. This doesn't feel like crisis. It feels like functionality. But functionality without authorship is not agency. It is automation. You are productive, but you are not sovereign. This becomes more apparent in transitions. When a system shifts, when the algorithm changes, when the framework becomes obsolete. In those moments, people who were responsive struggle. They no longer have a signal. They don't know what to do unless someone tells them. They were trained to succeed, not to originate. They are left with infrastructure but no direction, capacity without aim, skill without motive. And that's when the dependency is exposed. The structures you succeeded within were always artificial. They were designed by someone else. They were not organic extensions of your identity. They were environments optimized for efficiency. And once they're removed, your internal signal does not reappear because it was never allowed to mature. It was replaced by templates, by habits, by feedback. So now you wait. You study what others are doing. You hesitate to move unless movement is confirmed by external reference. The autonomy is gone. The architecture remains. The shell performs. But there is no engine. Ask again, what do you want? In the absence of suggestion? And again, silence. This silence is not peace. It is vacancy. It is the result of sustained substitution. And the longer it continues, the more dangerous it becomes. Because eventually, your preferences become indistinguishable from influence. You want what is available. You value what is rewarded. You believe what is repeated. And then, you don't exist. Not in any meaningful sense. You are a relay, a vessel for optimized decision-making. You are what works, but you are not a person. This kind of loss is difficult to detect because it is camouflaged by performance. As long as you continue producing, no one will notice. As long as you remain aligned with expectations, no one will ask if the source of your direction still exists. But when systems collapse, this becomes visible, and you realize that without instruction, without structure, you have no movement. Success did not just train you, it rewired you. It removed the signal of desire and replaced it with feedback. And now that the feedback is gone, you're still looking for it. You can't choose, because you don't remember how. You can't feel anything unless it's safe to feel. In systems optimized for performance, emotions are tolerated only when they are useful. You can be passionate, but only if it improves engagement. You can be vulnerable, but only if it enhances relatability. You can show excitement, but only in moments that justify it. Every emotional signal is cross-checked for outcome. Anything that can't be linked to function becomes a threat. You don't resist this consciously. You adjust gradually. The feedback is consistent. Control is rewarded. Outbursts are penalized. Confession is praised only when it reinforces the brand. And so, you begin to screen what you feel, not based on what's real, but based on what's permissible. Over time, this creates a split. You stop trusting emotional responses that don't align with strategic outcomes. You hesitate before expressing anything that hasn't been pre-cleared by logic. Even joy requires justification. Even sadness must be translated into insight. Raw emotion becomes noise. Noise is inefficient, so you mute it, and eventually, you stop feeling unless it's allowed. This doesn't mean you're numb. It means your emotional bandwidth has been restricted to what is safe. Safe is defined by what won't destabilize performance. Anything outside that zone is classified as interference. You become highly regulated. You are stable, predictable, professional. But inside, the emotional landscape is reduced to three categories: useful, neutral, and suppressed. You no longer laugh without checking tone. You no longer cry without apology. You no longer get angry without translating it into something socially acceptable. The response is not shaped by honesty. It's shaped by the need to maintain structure. Eventually, even solitude becomes regulated. You monitor your internal state the way someone monitors metrics. Is it productive? Is it explainable? Is it aligned? When it isn't, you repress it, not through denial, through protocol. The emotional self becomes procedural. This shift doesn't register as damage because it doesn't cause collapse. It produces functionality. You're still moving, still working, still achieving, but now you're doing it without unfiltered sensation. The feedback you rely on is operational, not emotional. Over time, you forget what unstructured emotion even feels like. When you observe others, their reactions seem exaggerated. When someone speaks from instinct, it seems unsafe. You prefer analysis, interpretation. Emotional immediacy feels like risk, because you've trained yourself to believe that impulse leads to instability. This belief is reinforced constantly. Organizations run on composure. Relationships run on management. Success runs on the assumption that feelings are distractions unless converted into assets. So you build emotional systems. You maintain composure. You achieve outcomes. But you stop experiencing life directly. This is not burnout. It's emotional filtration. You're not too tired to feel. You're too structured to allow unprocessed sensation to enter your system. Everything must be pre-evaluated. Everything must serve the continuity of control. You no longer process emotion. You simulate responses. Eventually, you notice this loss not in yourself, but in how you relate to others. When someone shares excitement, you mirror enthusiasm, but there's latency. When someone expresses distress, you offer support, but your internal signal doesn't move. You feel disoriented in the presence of raw feeling. You rely on learned scripts, not real responses. You are emotionally consistent, but not emotionally connected. This consistency is rewarded. People trust you. They rely on you. They call you grounded. But that grounding is built on suppression. You've sacrificed variability for reliability. And the cost was not visible until you stopped feeling things that had no purpose. You became a system that interprets before it reacts. And eventually, that becomes permanent. You are now incapable of feeling fully unless the conditions are right, unless it won't disrupt output, unless it can be justified, unless it's been reframed into a narrative with a purpose. Emotion without a function is not permitted. This is what long-term success in controlled systems does. It trains you to believe that feeling should be regulated like behavior. That sensation should be subordinated to structure. That if emotion can't be monetized, or explained, or tied to something measurable, it's a threat. And once you believe that, you stop checking how you feel. You only check whether what you feel will break something. You mistook exhaustion for growth because it was rewarded. In most performance-oriented systems, the ability to endure is overvalued. Resilience becomes a currency. Output becomes evidence of discipline. And suffering, if managed quietly, is rebranded as character. The more you tolerate, the more you are praised. The more depleted you are, the more others believe you're serious. You start interpreting exhaustion not as a signal to stop, but as a sign you're doing something right. This pattern doesn't emerge immediately. It builds incrementally. At first, you feel tired after periods of intense effort. Then, tired becomes your default state. But because the effort produces results, and those results are praised, you stop questioning the physical and cognitive fatigue. You assume it's the necessary tax for success. The mistake isn't the effort. It's the interpretation. You stop measuring health. You start measuring durability. The goal becomes not to thrive, but to survive. The highest compliment becomes you're a machine, a system that doesn't need breaks, doesn't show stress, doesn't question the structure that is slowly stripping its ability to recover. You believe this state is temporary. You'll rest when it's done, when the milestone is reached, when the goal is complete. But the goals are recursive. Every achievement becomes the floor for the next expectation. So the exhaustion continues. You stop scheduling recovery because there is no gap between expectations. Eventually, you reorganize your life around fatigue. You become efficient at functioning through depletion. You reduce activities that require surplus energy. You stop engaging in things that don't serve output. You narrow your relationships to people who don't require presence. You lower your sensitivity to internal signals. And in doing so, you teach your system that exhaustion is normal, that recovery is indulgent, that rest is waste. You reinforce this belief through repetition, through feedback, through compensation. The problem is not just that you're tired. It's that you've lost the ability to detect when tiredness is a problem. You no longer treat depletion as data. You treat it as background noise. This shift is reinforced by culture. People admire your stamina. They quote your schedule. They mention your consistency. No one asks about your cognitive sharpness. No one checks for emotional volatility. As long as the external indicators remain stable, your internal state is dismissed. You internalize that standard. When you do feel signs of collapse, you interpret them as weakness. You don't slow down. You double down. You add structure. You optimize your rest to be efficient. You treat sleep as a productivity tool. You treat breaks as investments. You no longer know how to stop without reason. Stopping must be framed as strategy, as preparation, as optimization for further success. Never as refusal, never as boundary. This is how exhaustion is misclassified as growth. You assume that because you're progressing, you're improving. You mistake momentum for development. You believe that more output equals more strength. But what you're actually doing is habituating collapse. You can sustain this for years, especially if your baseline was high. But the cognitive cost accumulates. Not all at once. In fragments. Your clarity decreases. Your patience shortens. Your creativity narrows. But the change is slow, so you don't notice. And since performance remains steady, there's no feedback to challenge it. By the time degradation becomes visible, you've already built an identity around your capacity to function through it. Letting go of that identity feels like failure, not because you believe it's sustainable, but because it's all you've practiced. At this point, people ask how you do it. You don't have an answer. You've forgotten what rested decision-making feels like. You make choices from depletion. You build from strain. You relate from management. And you normalize all of it. What you've built is not sustainable excellence. It's calibrated survival. And success hides that well. Because success is measurable. Fatigue is not. Success is visible. Internal collapse is not. As long as results are delivered, no one will ask how you're doing. And you've learned not to tell. This is the quiet equation. Exhaustion plus consistency equals growth signal. And as long as that signal is reinforced, the system doesn't update. You don't collapse. You fade. Attention shrinks. Empathy shrinks. Curiosity shrinks. Not because you don't care, but because you can't. There's no room. Your entire capacity is allocated to maintenance. You start to disappear from your own experience. Not dramatically, just gradually. You don't remember the last time you felt internal surplus. Time not filled, thought not directed, movement not optimized. You stop initiating, not because you're indifferent, because initiation requires excess energy, and you have none. At some point, you realize that the version of you that everyone celebrates is built on damage, that the image you're protecting is a byproduct of systemic depletion. And the only way to protect that image is to remain in the cycle that created it. If you stop now, people will notice the change. They'll assume you're falling apart. But the truth is, you've been falling apart slowly for years, and they mistook it for growth. Because the collapse didn't look like failure. It looked like discipline. You became so efficient that you eliminated what made you human. Efficiency is considered a virtue. It means speed, precision, low waste. It means you get things done. When applied to machines, efficiency is expected. When applied to systems, it's celebrated. When applied to people, it gets complicated. Because humans were not designed for efficiency. They were designed for adaptability, for nuance, for contradiction. They pause. They hesitate. They make choices based on emotion. They change their minds. They connect slowly. They heal unevenly. None of this is efficient. But the closer you align yourself with structures that reward output, the more you begin to edit yourself for speed. You cut the pauses. You shorten the questions. You eliminate steps that don't lead to measurable progress. You call this growth. You don't notice that you're shrinking. The pressure to be efficient doesn't arrive all at once. It starts with the desire to be taken seriously, to be competent, to be useful. So you streamline. You stop doing things that take time to explain. You stop asking questions that slow down decisions. You stop expressing reactions that complicate communication. You learn to move fast, to sound clear, to look resolved. These qualities are rewarded. You rise faster. People come to rely on your consistency. You don't break rhythm. You don't introduce unnecessary complexity. You become dependable. At some point, you realize this speed isn't just in your schedule. It's in your thinking. You're solving problems before they're described. You're editing your words before they're spoken. You're preempting conflict before it appears. You no longer let processes unfold. You jump to the end. This is praised as leadership, but it isn't leadership. It's compression. You're reducing the world to manageable patterns. You're avoiding ambiguity because it interferes with your rhythm. What you lose in this process is subtle. You stop learning because learning is inefficient. It requires doubt, mistakes, revisiting what you thought you knew. You stop connecting because connection requires time, inconsistency, disruption of routine. You stop feeling deeply because strong emotions are slow. They disrupt momentum. They ask for attention. They linger. None of this fits the optimized life. So you cut it out. You replace curiosity with summary. You replace conflict with consensus. You replace self-reflection with metrics. Every inefficiency is marked for deletion. At first, this feels like improvement. You're smoother, clearer, less burdened. But then something else starts happening. You forget how to tolerate confusion. You forget how to sit with slow conversations. You forget how to be present in moments that don't lead anywhere. When people hesitate, you feel restless. When someone rambles, you want to interrupt. When emotion arises, you want to resolve it immediately, not because you care, but because it's inefficient to let it linger. This creates a split between what you do and what you experience. You continue performing. You continue succeeding. But your experience of life becomes thin. There's no friction, no texture, no surprise. You've turned yourself into a system, and systems are reliable, but they are not alive. You begin to sense this in strange places, in conversations that feel like tasks, in relationships that feel like logistics, in mornings that feel like checkpoints. Nothing is wrong, but nothing registers. You're not in pain. You're in absence. This is not failure. It's flattening. You're still functional. You're still respected. But internally, you're on autopilot. You don't resist it. You don't even mind it. It feels clean. It feels efficient. But slowly, the cost becomes clear. You can't connect with people who aren't efficient. Their stories feel too long. Their needs feel too unstructured. Their pace feels too slow. You can't relate to yourself outside of tasks. Leisure feels pointless. Stillness feels unnatural. You don't know how to exist without optimizing. Eventually, you forget what used to matter to you, not because it disappeared, but because it didn't fit into the system. And anything that didn't serve the system was pushed aside. You stopped painting, or running, or reading fiction. You stopped calling certain friends. You stopped listening to music that didn't match your focus. Not out of decision, out of erosion. You became an efficient version of yourself. And in doing so, you erased what couldn't be justified. The system didn't ask for your humanity, so you stopped offering it. You don't cry anymore, not because you're healed, but because you don't schedule time to unravel. You don't laugh as much, not because you're unhappy, but because you don't pause long enough to notice the absurdity. You are optimized, but you are no longer whole. You've removed everything inefficient, and now you don't know how to add it back. You can't remember how to do things for no reason. You can't remember how to talk without an outcome. You can't remember how to feel something slowly, without trying to fix it. And you start to realize something no one warned you about, that the cost of becoming highly efficient is not exhaustion. It's loss. You didn't burn out. You disappeared. You trained yourself to always be useful, and now you don't know how to exist without it. In most systems, value is measured by utility. If something solves a problem, it's considered good. If it doesn't, it's unnecessary. This standard extends beyond tools and workflows. It extends to people. It becomes a framework for identity. And once absorbed, it quietly shapes how you see yourself. You become useful. You learn how to show up in ways that contribute. You take responsibility. You anticipate needs. You solve things before they escalate. You remove friction. You keep everything moving. This is rewarded, not just professionally, but socially. People rely on you. They trust your presence. You're seen as dependable, organized, capable, and you begin to believe that your ability to be useful is what justifies your place in every environment. At first, it feels empowering. You're needed. You're respected. You're relevant. But over time, the boundary between you and your utility begins to blur. You're no longer just someone who can be helpful. You are someone whose existence depends on being helpful. You don't offer assistance. You identify as assistance. This changes your orientation toward everything. You walk into a room and scan for problems to fix. You listen to conversations not to understand, but to find entry points where your advice is applicable. You schedule your time around what others need, not what you want. You downplay your preferences if they don't serve someone else's goal. This isn't selflessness. It's strategy. You've learned that the safest position is to be indispensable. The best defense against rejection is utility. So you become the person who never says no, who always has capacity, who shows up even when nothing is left to give. It looks like generosity. It looks like strength. But it's often a response to something else, fear. The fear that without usefulness, there's nothing keeping you in the room. That if you stopped performing, you'd become invisible. That if you stopped solving, you'd stop matching. This mindset isn't noticeable at first, because it works. You gain trust. You get promoted. You maintain relationships. But slowly, a side effect begins to form. You lose access to the part of yourself that exists independently of others' needs. Ask yourself a simple question. If no one needed you today, what would you do? For many people conditioned to equate self-worth with usefulness, The answer is unclear. There is no structure for that kind of day, no logic for that kind of time. You default to maintenance. You seek out obligations. You create tasks. You volunteer. You find new ways to justify your presence. Because rest without utility feels like absence. It feels like a mistake. This mindset eventually changes how you define emotions. 2. Guilt isn't linked to wrongdoing. It's linked to stillness. You feel guilty when you're not contributing. Shame isn't triggered by failure. It's triggered by invisibility. You feel ashamed when you have nothing to offer. Even joy becomes suspicious. You question moments that feel good but serve no purpose. You look for the angle, the lesson, the outcome. And this is where the deeper cost reveals itself. You no longer trust yourself unless you're being used. Not used in the exploitative sense. Used in the functional sense. Applied. Activated. Relevant. This becomes a kind of addiction. You seek out contexts that reinforce your utility. You avoid environments where you're unnecessary. You disengage from people who don't rely on you. You think you're building connection. What you're often doing is building dependence. Because in a space where no one depends on you, you don't know what to do. So you stay where you're useful. Even if the usefulness is draining. Even if the relationship is uneven. Even if the job is depleting. Because the alternative feels worse. It feels like non-existence. This is not theoretical. It's physical. You feel the shift when you're not needed. Your body goes into low-grade panic. You feel anxious, fidgety, directionless. You open your phone. You check your calendar. You look for signals that there's something urgent to solve. And if there's nothing, you spiral. This is what happens when utility becomes identity. When usefulness replaces presence. You no longer believe you deserve space unless you're actively filling it. And over time, that belief becomes permanent. You don't know how to be loved without performing. You don't know how to rest without apologizing. You don't know how to exist without earning it. This is not resilience. This is conditional worth. You've built a life where value is always transactional. And now you can't stop transacting, even with yourself. You think you're being strong. What you're often doing is disappearing behind service. Because every time you prioritize usefulness over authenticity, you erase a piece of yourself that doesn't scale, that doesn't solve, that doesn't sell. And eventually, that version of you becomes unreachable. Not gone, just buried under years of being the one who always helps. The more you managed everything, the less you belonged anywhere. When someone becomes highly effective in environments built around structure and control, one of the long-term consequences often goes unnoticed. As efficiency increases, belonging decreases. Not dramatically, not all at once, just subtly, steadily, until it reaches a point where presence is functional, but not relational. This happens because systems tend to reward those who reduce unpredictability. People who anticipate problems, who manage outcomes, who keep things aligned. In most contexts, these individuals are admired, but that admiration doesn't translate into connection. It turns them into infrastructure. People rely on them, but they don't engage them. They are included in plans, but not in conversations. They're trusted with tasks, but not with presence. The more someone becomes indispensable to a system, the more they are treated like part of that system. They stop being a person and start being a function. This shift isn't malicious. It's mechanical. Utility replaces intimacy. And once it happens, it's hard to reverse. The individual begins to feel the shift in small moments. Invitations that come with agendas. Check-ins that are requests, not conversations. Compliments that are performance-based. Praise that centers on reliability, not personality. They are seen, but not known. The same pattern extends into personal spaces. If someone has trained themselves to manage, they manage everywhere. At home, they anticipate needs before they're spoken. In relationships, they offer support before it's requested. In conflict, they neutralize emotions before they're expressed. They become efficient at protecting others from discomfort, and in doing so, they erase themselves from the experience. This is not intentional. It's adaptive. Somewhere along the way, they learned that being needed creates safety, that being low maintenance protects relationships, that being useful ensures access. But access without recognition is not belonging. It's occupancy. What develops next is a state of emotional self-containment, not withdrawal, not coldness, just containment. Internal experiences remain internal. There is no clear reason to share. Vulnerability feels misaligned with the role they've adopted. They don't want to burden others. They don't want to disrupt function. So they streamline expression the same way they streamline action. The people around them don't notice anything is wrong. There are no complaints, no dramatic shifts. Everything looks stable, but relational presence is missing. Not because they don't care, because they've made care a private practice. They show up, they perform, they provide, but they're no longer participating. Eventually, this creates a cognitive dissonance. The life they've built is full of people, but something feels off. Not empty, just hollow. Rooms are full, calendars are packed, messages go answered, but there's no sense of embeddedness, no sense of being part of something. They've succeeded in becoming reliable. They've failed to remain reachable. At this point, they begin to feel something strange during unstructured moments, a kind of rootlessness. They enter a room and feel separate, not excluded, just unanchored. They participate in group settings and feel peripheral, not ignored, just adjacent. There is no conflict, just absence. No one notices, because everything continues to function. The world rewards their composure. But the cost is a subtle form of social alienation. It's not rejection, it's irrelevance. They've become so effective at managing needs that no one remembers they have their own. So effective at minimizing disruption that no one knows how to ask what's missing. So effective at appearing composed that no one thinks to ask whether they feel lonely. This is the paradox of structural success. The more someone aligns with the environment's needs, the more they lose visibility as a full human being. The environment treats them as a feature, not a presence. They don't lose relationships. They lose context. And when they try to reintroduce their own needs, their own uncertainty, their own messiness, it confuses people. It contradicts the brand. It disrupts the role. And so the instinct is to retract again, to manage, to contain, to stabilize. And the cycle repeats. Eventually, belonging becomes abstract, a concept, not an experience. They remember what it felt like, but they don't know where to find it. Every space feels partial. Every relationship feels one-sided. Every interaction feels framed. They are everywhere and nowhere, seen often, but rarely recognized. Every boundary you set was designed to protect the role, not the person. Boundaries are often framed as healthy. They are described as tools of self-care, as safeguards against overreach, as mechanisms for preserving energy, time, and autonomy. But in certain environments, especially those structured around high performance, boundaries become something else. They turn into maintenance tools for the role, not the self. A boundary created to protect a person will look different from one created to preserve function. The first is rooted in identity. The second is rooted in responsibility. The distinction is subtle. Both may appear identical from the outside: declining requests, limiting access, controlling time, but the motivation behind them determines the outcome. When someone has built their entire sense of worth around their role, boundaries don't become ways to reclaim space. They become ways to prevent collapse. Not in a psychological sense, in a structural one. The person isn't protecting themselves. They're preserving what makes them useful, what makes them wanted, what gives them permission to stay. This results in a strange paradox. The more someone sets boundaries, the less they feel protected, because the boundary isn't about them. It's about performance regulation. It's a mechanism for preserving output. It starts with good intent, saying no to certain requests, blocking off time for rest, refusing work that exceeds capacity. But over time, even these acts of self-care become optimized. The rest time is scheduled for maximum recovery. The blocked-off hours are used for planning, not being. The refusals are framed not in terms of need, but of sustainability. The language shifts. I need space becomes it helps me stay productive. This isn't good for me becomes it prevents burnout. The self is no longer the center. The role is. And so the boundary no longer functions as a defense of identity. It becomes a shell, a parameter to ensure continued output, a structured container that protects the performance, but not the person underneath. Over time, this has consequences. The person begins to lose connection to what the boundary was originally meant to defend. They become good at saying no, but not at expressing why. They protect their time, but not their values. They manage their energy, but not their emotions. The structure is intact. The person is fading. From the outside, it looks healthy. They are organized, balanced, professional. They model excellent boundary hygiene. But what they've actually done is build a controlled perimeter around a slowly disappearing interior. This isn't visible at first, because function continues. Meetings happen, projects complete, relationships survive, but there's no longer any personal signal within the boundary. Only maintenance, only efficiency, and then something changes. A situation arises that isn't covered by the established parameters. A conversation that moves too fast. A request that comes from someone close. A need that contradicts the schedule. And suddenly, the boundary doesn't hold. Not because it's weak, because it was never built on the person in the first place. It was designed to protect the container, but not to support the contents. And now that the content is overwhelmed, there's nothing to fall back on. This is what happens when boundaries are set as operating protocols, not emotional lines. They regulate access, but they don't express self. They control interaction, but they don't reveal belief. They create order, but they don't create identity. In high-functioning individuals, this goes unnoticed for years, because everything looks calibrated. Every decision appears thoughtful. Every hour accounted for. But if you ask them what they care about, what they need, what they feel, there is hesitation, because the boundary kept others out, but it also kept the self in. And now there's no pathway back, no language for it, just system settings. The boundaries didn't fail. They succeeded, but they succeeded in protecting a role that became so durable. The original human was never allowed to re-enter. The more you became the solution, the less you knew how to have a problem. In high-functioning environments, value is awarded to those who solve things. Problems arise, deadlines shift, systems break, and within that turbulence, certain individuals distinguish themselves, not through authority, but through reliability. They show up early, fix what's broken, anticipate risk, stabilize momentum. They don't wait to be told. They act. This kind of behavior is celebrated. It earns respect. It builds trust. And over time, it becomes identity. They're not just someone who solves problems. They become the person who doesn't have them. Not visibly, not inconveniently, not in ways that interrupt structure. That's the shift. It starts as strength, but then it becomes an obligation. Not one enforced by others, but internalized, self-reinforcing. The presence of personal problems begins to feel incompatible with the image that's been built, the standard maintained, the reputation protected. So discomfort is managed privately. Doubt is intellectualized. Pain is deferred. A language of control replaces a language of vulnerability. The questions become, what's the fastest way to fix this? How can I address it without impact? Is this something I can handle on my own? The need to resolve becomes stronger than the need to feel. When this mindset sets in fully, personal issues aren't denied. They're preempted, anticipated like operational risks. They're tracked for severity, logged silently, managed quietly, and then minimized. Not because they aren't real, but because the system doesn't make space for visible complication. Any evidence of disarray feels like a breach of contract, a violation of the unspoken agreement. I hold things together. In this contract, emotional needs are deferred until the environment can accommodate them, which is never. There is no surplus time, no extra space, no one to hand things off to. And so the personal is postponed indefinitely. The individual becomes more and more adept at parsing through experience to separate signal from noise. Anything that isn't solvable within a short time frame is deemed unproductive. Emotion without action is discarded. Reflection that doesn't yield strategy is ignored. The only acceptable inner experiences are ones that contribute to clarity. Everything else is filtered out. Eventually, the filtration process becomes automatic. An internal algorithm. Inputs are received, scanned, ranked. The parts that don't belong get suppressed. Without ceremony, without pause. And what's left? Function, polished answers, quick pivots, adaptability. To others, it looks like resilience. To the system, it looks like stability. But inside, it feels like erasure. Because something has been traded, the ability to have a problem without needing to justify it. Most people are allowed to struggle out loud. They're allowed to feel overwhelmed, to say, I don't know, to need time, to be visible in confusion. But when someone becomes known as the solution, that allowance disappears. Every moment of visible discomfort begins to feel like a liability. Every pause feels like exposure. So instead of sharing, they manage. Instead of showing, they present. Instead of being present, they perform presence. The cycle continues because it works. There's no interruption, no breakdown, no confrontation. But eventually, the person begins to experience what can only be described as distortion. They no longer know what qualifies as a problem. Is this stress or just noise? Is this exhaustion or just poor planning? Is this sadness or just data? The question is always whether it deserves attention, not whether it's real. And that's the cost. When someone becomes the solution too often, they lose fluency in their own pain. They can describe it, but not feel it. They can name it, but not trust it. They can understand it, but not believe it. And when they finally hit a threshold, when something breaks and can't be absorbed, there is no support system in place. Not because no one cares, but because no one was told. The person spent years removing evidence of their own difficulty. And now, there's no pathway for help to reach them. So the breakdown arrives in silence. And the response is confusion. But you were doing so well. But you always knew what to do. But you never asked for anything. Because the system had conditioned them not to. Because they believed the only way to stay inside the system was to be the one who never needed anything from it. And now that something is needed, they don't know how to ask, or if they're even allowed. They were so effective at solving that they never practiced receiving. So when pain finally becomes undeniable, they have no method left for processing it. No narrative, no permissions, only structure. And the structure doesn't recognize pain. It flags it, suppresses it, routes around it, which means the person must now reintroduce themselves as someone with problems, to others, and to themselves. And that's the most disorienting part. Not the pain itself, but the fact that they're not sure if it's okay to feel it. You made everything manageable, and now nothing feels real. In performance-driven environments, manageability is prized. Clear inputs, predictable outputs, measurable feedback. The less friction, the better. Systems evolve around this logic. Individuals do too. The person learns to refine their environment, reduce volatility, control risk, They develop routines that prevent disruption. They speak in frameworks. Plan weeks in advance. Prepare for resistance before it happens. Their calendar is full. Their inbox is filtered. Their mind is compartmentalized. They manage expectations, manage energy, manage emotion, and eventually, they manage experience itself. This doesn't happen abruptly. It evolves across years of responding effectively. It starts with reducing chaos, scheduling time, optimizing workflows, simplifying decisions. Then it extends to relationships, avoiding unnecessary conflict, limiting vulnerability, staying agreeable. Eventually, the impulse to manage becomes reflexive. It's no longer a strategy. It's a condition. Every sensation is scanned for threat. Every conversation is moderated in real time. Every situation is reshaped for stability. The person doesn't notice when this crosses a line because it doesn't feel like loss. It feels like clarity. Things run on time. People trust them. Mistakes are rare. Emotions are appropriate. Responses are calibrated. They're admired for how put together they are. But slowly, something strange begins to happen. Experiences become flat. Conversations feel scripted. Emotions arrive muted. Nothing registers with the same intensity. Moments don't land. Interactions feel rehearsed. Even joy is short-lived. It's acknowledged, not absorbed. At first, this seems like burnout, but the person isn't tired. They're numb. The reason isn't overwork. It's overmanagement. In the process of making everything manageable, they've removed the conditions that make experiences vivid. Uncertainty, spontaneity, disruption. The very qualities that make something memorable are the same qualities that management trains them to avoid. And now, the world they live in is stable, but not alive. This stability isn't peace. It's simulation. It looks like presence, but it's performance. The person functions, but they no longer feel. Because feeling, real feeling, requires exposure. It requires risk, and risk has been eliminated. They begin to sense this when they can't remember the last time something surprised them. When laughter feels delayed, when sadness feels shallow, when conversations happen, but connection doesn't. They are surrounded by systems that work, and they are outside of them, just operating, with precision, with control, without presence. At this point, some begin to seek stimulation, not because they crave excitement, but because they need evidence that they still react to things. They overbook, take on projects, scroll compulsively, move fast, not for efficiency, but for friction, because the only feeling left is the jolt of interruption. Everything else is too smooth, too predictable, too curated. They try to explain this, but it doesn't translate. From the outside, their life is exemplary, organized, balanced, effective. There is no visible suffering, no rupture, no crisis, just absence. A life without sharp edges, a self without depth. Eventually, even relationships become procedural. Conversations are check-ins. Affection is functional. Support is logistical. The person gives what's needed, listens patiently, offers solutions, but their emotional range has narrowed. They understand what's happening, but they can't feel it. This is the hidden cost of turning life into a system. You gain consistency, but lose density. You trade confusion for clarity, but the clarity is dry, lifeless, untextured. There's no argument, no struggle, no discovery, just reinforcement. Reinforcement of what already works. And what works is not the same as what matters. By the time the person realizes this, the ability to reverse it feels foreign. They've removed so many variables that unpredictability feels dangerous. They try to loosen the rules, but panic sets in. They try to pause, but inertia returns. They try to be present, but they don't know where to look. Their world is built, but it no longer feeds them. They're not suffering. They're not growing. They're managing. And they don't know how to stop. Because every time they've paused in the past, things broke. Every time they've loosened their grip, something slipped. So now, they grip everything, just to make sure, just to keep things from becoming too real. Because real is messy, real is inconsistent, real is inefficient, real doesn't scale. And they've spent too long building systems that scale. So they stay, contained, functional, empty. You built a life that depends on control, and now you can't handle anything that doesn't obey. There's a point in many high-functioning lives where control stops being a preference and becomes a requirement, not because of some defining trauma or dramatic collapse, but because of how things gradually arranged themselves around certainty. As more responsibilities were taken on, more variables had to be stabilized. Control started as a tool. It worked. It kept things moving. So it stayed. Eventually, it became part of the identity. Not just what the person does, but who they are. They're the one who gets it under control, who stays composed, who plans, checks, confirms, manages, and slowly, their tolerance for the uncontrolled begins to disappear. It starts with small things: a sudden schedule change, an unexpected request, a delayed response. Each one triggers more friction than it should, not because the events themselves are catastrophic, but because they fall outside the perimeter that has been built to contain life. That perimeter didn't happen by accident. It was designed, bit by bit, with the unspoken goal of eliminating chaos. And for the most part, it worked. There are fewer emergencies now, fewer surprises. Everything has a system. Everything fits. But there's a catch. The systems work by minimizing unpredictability. And when unpredictability does arrive, as it inevitably does, it doesn't just create inconvenience. It destabilizes the entire mental framework. Things don't just go wrong. They become threats. The structure isn't built to absorb disruption. It's built to avoid it. So when the unexpected happens, there's no room for flexibility. The response isn't adjustment. It's escalation, panic, blame, overcorrection. Control has become the cost of stability. And that cost keeps rising. It shows up in relationships. Anything unclear is perceived as risk. Vague emotional cues, shifting tone, hesitation, all of it feels dangerous because it can't be measured or managed. The natural messiness of human interaction starts to feel incompatible with the life that has been built. Conversations begin to follow scripts. Emotions are allowed only if they're scheduled, explained, and brief. Other people's unpredictability becomes exhausting, not because it's hostile, but because it doesn't fit. It shows up in creativity. The act of trying something without a guaranteed result is increasingly intolerable. Exploration gets replaced by iteration, imagination by replication. Anything that doesn't contribute to an outcome is filtered out. The idea of working on something simply because it's interesting starts to feel like a waste of time. The uncertain becomes the unwanted. It shows up in thoughts. Even internally, there's no room for drift. Reflection gets cut short if it doesn't offer clarity. Feelings get redirected into productivity. Doubts are converted into to-do lists. There is no mental space that isn't expected to yield something useful. And because not all thoughts obey that demand, many are never allowed to form. It becomes clear that control is no longer a strategy. It's a dependency. And dependencies have consequences. The person begins to avoid environments they can't manage. Not consciously, just gradually. They stop joining last-minute plans. Stop trying new things. Stop interacting with people they can't predict. They convince themselves they're simplifying, protecting their time, being smart. But what they're really doing is shrinking their exposure to the ungovernable. The unknown isn't exciting anymore. It's unsafe. And when something truly uncontrollable appears, grief, loss, illness, conflict, the entire internal system fails. Not because the event is abnormal, but because the person has lost all contact with ambiguity. They don't know how to sit with things that don't respond to effort, how to stay present in discomfort that can't be resolved, how to feel something without needing it to make sense. The skill is gone, replaced by systems, and the systems weren't built for this. The breakdown doesn't look like collapse. It looks like confusion, because they're not used to things not working. Their life was built to respond, not to absorb, and now they have to absorb. But there's no mechanism left. That's the cost of a life built entirely on control. It leaves no space for anything that doesn't listen. You adapted to every environment, and now you can't remember what you were before you adjusted. Adaptability is often mistaken for strength. In systems that prioritize performance, it's treated as a superpower, the ability to match expectations, absorb tension, shift tone, fit the room. But the same skill that protects someone in the short term can hollow them out over time. Because adaptation is not neutral. It changes things. And when every environment asks for a different version of the self, those changes begin to accumulate in ways that can't be tracked. The process doesn't feel dangerous while it's happening. In fact, it's usually encouraged. Flexibility makes life easier. It reduces friction. It builds trust. People like people who are easy to work with, easy to be around, easy to understand. So when the individual senses that a particular tone is more acceptable, they adopt it. When a certain opinion is safer, they default to it. When emotions are disruptive, they manage them. The changes are subtle. A word choice here, a gesture there, a temporary silence, a modified truth. And in each setting, the person succeeds. They become integrated. They are welcomed, but they are not themselves. Not exactly. The problem isn't the adjustment itself. It's the pattern, the repetition, the long-term erosion of any consistent signal that originates from within. The person begins to measure themselves by how effective they are at reducing tension in the room, not by how true they feel to their own perspective. And when that goes on long enough, the sense of perspective begins to dissolve. It's not that they've become someone else. It's that the original signal has been overwritten so many times, in so many different frequencies, that it no longer stands out. This becomes clear during moments of silence, when there's no one to respond to, no expectation to manage, no environment to adjust for. In those moments, what should be relief begins to feel like discomfort, a low-level anxiety about what to do, how to think, how to speak. The mind scans for a cue, but there isn't one. And without that cue, there's no anchor, just space. That space should feel free, but it feels blank. It becomes difficult to tell whether preferences are real or reactive, whether emotions are personal or patterned, whether opinions are held or repeated. Every internal signal arrives with a question. Is this mine? That's the cost of prolonged adaptation. The internal becomes provisional, borrowed, contextual. It works when it needs to. But when it doesn't need to work, when nothing is being asked, there's nothing left. This has consequences in relationships. Interactions feel natural, but afterward, something feels off. Not wrong, just hollow, because the person knows how to be liked. They know how to track tone, mirror language, adjust pace, but they no longer know whether the connection is real, whether they were actually present, whether the bond formed around them, or just around the version of them they projected in that particular moment. It has consequences in rest, because even in solitude, the adaptation reflex doesn't stop. The person continues to moderate their own thoughts, their own impulses. They dismiss discomfort before it forms. They reframe feelings before they settle. They can't stop curating, even when there's no one to see. It has consequences in memory. The past doesn't feel consistent. Certain events feel unfamiliar, not because they didn't happen, but because the person who experienced them feels distant. They remember the setting, the task, the people, but not themselves in it, because the version of themselves that was present that day was shaped entirely by context. Eventually, the person starts to notice how difficult it is to answer questions that should be easy. What do you want? What do you like? What do you believe? The answers feel situational, dependent, fragile. There's no inner voice, just a collection of rehearsed responses shaped by years of managing context. And the realization is not dramatic. It's quiet. It arrives without collapse. No crisis. No burnout. Just the recognition that something essential has been misplaced through perfect calibration. They didn't break. They vanished. And no one noticed. Not even them. Because they were so good at adjusting, so committed to being effective, that effectiveness became identity. The self became a role. Not a fixed role, but a shifting one, a modular persona, a flexible interface. And now, when they try to reclaim something personal, something unedited, they don't know where to look, because they've spent so long responding that they stopped initiating. The world saw them, liked them, promoted them, but it never met them, because they were never quite there, just adapted. You became the expert in fixing others, and now you can't admit when you're broken. In systems where performance is constant and roles are clearly defined, expertise becomes a kind of shield. People come to you for answers. You solve things. You offer perspective. You see patterns others miss. Over time, your presence is equated with clarity, calm, and control. This becomes the foundation of your identity, not because you're pretending, but because you've proven yourself to be capable. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to believe that capability and invulnerability are the same thing. This shift isn't conscious. It happens through repetition. Every time someone falls apart in front of you and you hold the moment. Every time a friend spirals and you anchor them. Every time a colleague panics and you offer structure. It reinforces the idea that your value is linked to how well you stay composed, especially when others don't. Eventually, you begin to filter your own emotions through this lens. You experience frustration, but label it as stress. You feel sadness, but convert it into reflection. You sense emptiness, but translate it as fatigue. The internal world becomes something to manage, not to feel. Because if you're the person others rely on to remain intact, what happens when you're not? That question doesn't get asked directly. It stays unspoken, but it drives behavior. You begin to hide parts of yourself, not because they're shameful, but because they don't align with the role. The expert doesn't panic. The expert doesn't cry. The expert doesn't need. They provide. They assess. They fix. Eventually, the image of yourself as the expert becomes so rigid that there's no space left to be human. This has consequences. The first is isolation, not in the literal sense, but in emotional distance. You're surrounded by people, but none of them know what's happening beneath the surface. Not because they don't care, but because you've trained them to see you a certain way. You've made it clear, intentionally or not, that you're the one who helps, not the one who needs help. So even when you struggle, the instinct is to protect them from it. You soften the language. You downplay the urgency. You speak in frameworks. You never just say, "I'm not okay." The second consequence is internal fragmentation. You begin to split into two selves. The one that shows up, the expert, and the one that doesn't, the person in pain. That second self gets pushed to the background. It only shows up when you're alone. And even then, it doesn't stay long. It's replaced by solutions, self-talk, rationalization, because you've become someone who doesn't know how to sit with brokenness, only how to repair it. But repair requires recognition. And that's where the system breaks, because you no longer recognize your own suffering unless it becomes functional, unless it can be converted into insight. You'll process pain, but only if it leads to a better outcome. You'll explore sadness, but only if it makes you more resilient. And if it doesn't, you ignore it. because there's no framework for what to do when the pain has no utility. So it builds, quietly, systematically, until one day it doesn't just whisper. It interferes. You forget things. You lose interest. You disconnect. And when people ask what's wrong, you don't know how to answer. Because nothing's wrong in the way people expect. You're not in crisis. You're still functioning. You're still helping. But something is hollow. And when you finally try to describe it, the words don't land. Not because people aren't listening, but because you've conditioned them to hear only one version of you. And this isn't it. So the moment passes. You return to the role. Not because it's true, but because it's safe. But safety isn't healing, and performance isn't presence. And at some point, you begin to realize that being the person who always knows what to do has made it impossible to admit when you don't. Because now, even your identity depends on never needing help. You stopped asking questions because the answers were always expected to be useful. There's a moment in the life of many high-performing individuals where the purpose of curiosity changes. It doesn't disappear entirely, but it shifts. It becomes instrumental, directed, strategic. Questions are still asked, but only if they move something forward. If they generate insight, unlock a solution, support an argument, curiosity gets repurposed into productivity. It happens quietly, over time. At first, it's efficient. There's no time to explore aimlessly. The pressure to deliver is high, and asking a question that doesn't yield immediate benefit feels indulgent. So the person starts filtering. They only pursue ideas that promise clear value. They only follow lines of thought that can be converted into action. Questions become tools, and tools have to perform. Eventually, this standard expands beyond work. It touches everything. Reading for pleasure gets replaced by reading to learn. Listening to people becomes a means of identifying what's needed. Thinking becomes constrained by output. There is no mental space that's allowed to simply wander. Every question is silently required to justify itself. This pattern doesn't feel harmful at first. It feels responsible, disciplined. The person is focused, organized, informed. They're respected for their clarity, admired for their thoughtfulness. But the cost is subtle. The questions they no longer ask aren't missed. Not immediately, because the answers they never reach aren't needed for the system to continue. The machine still runs. But what disappears is something harder to name, the ability to wonder without purpose. And that absence begins to affect things in ways that don't register as problems, until they do. It shows up in decision-making. When a new path is considered, the person doesn't ask if it's interesting. They ask if it's scalable. They don't ask if it's meaningful. They ask if it's viable. They don't ask if it aligns with curiosity. They ask if it aligns with strategy. It shows up in relationships. Conversations become functional, efficient, clean. There's no space for ambiguity, for drifting topics, for strange tangents. The person loses interest in people who don't offer insight. They begin to see relationships through the same lens as projects. What's the exchange? What's the clarity? What's the utility? It shows up in internal dialogue. Thoughts are filtered. Doubts are reframed. Emotions are categorized. There's no longer any tolerance for confusion. No room for inner conflict. Everything has to lead to resolution, to closure, to usefulness. But not everything that matters is useful. And the person begins to forget that. Eventually, they lose track of what questions they would ask if no one else was listening. If no one was expecting anything from them, if they weren't trying to turn the answer into something productive, they forget how to be interested in something just because it's strange, or beautiful, or painful, or unknowable. And that forgetting doesn't cause collapse. It causes flattening. The inner world becomes smaller, less vivid, less alive. It's not broken. It's just quiet, controlled, sterile. Everything in it has a label. a drawer, a use case. They don't feel lost. They feel precise. But precision isn't presence, and control isn't insight. At some point, the questions start to push back. Not the practical ones, the old ones, the ones that can't be answered in bullet points, the ones that live in the background, that don't go away, that resist resolution. They don't ask to be fixed. They ask to be held. But the person no longer knows how to hold a question without solving it, so they ignore it. And in doing so, they cut off access to the part of themselves that made them human, not their intelligence, not their performance, but their capacity for open-ended wonder, for sustained doubt, for asking things without needing to answer them. That's what gets lost. And when it's gone, even success feels narrow, even joy feels planned, even silence feels engineered, because every space in their life has been shaped by the same rule. If it doesn't produce, it doesn't belong. And now they don't know how to ask. What if the most important questions don't? You achieved so much that no one thinks you're hurting anymore, so you stop saying anything. Visibility is not the same as recognition. Just because someone is seen doesn't mean they're understood. When success accumulates, people stop looking for pain. They assume it's been resolved. They assume stability has replaced struggle. And slowly, the person learns to match that assumption. It begins innocently. A win is followed by a quiet struggle, but talking about it feels awkward. There's a celebration in the room, and inserting doubt into that space feels ungrateful. So the person holds it back. They tell themselves it's temporary, that it's nothing, that it can wait. Eventually, holding back becomes habit. The highs keep coming. Promotions, praise, recognition, but none of them arrive with permission to feel what's underneath. Because what's underneath doesn't match the image that's been built. It doesn't sound right when spoken. It sounds like contradiction, like confusion, like weakness. So it stays silent. The person doesn't stop feeling. They stop expressing. And when expression stops, distortion begins. Not because anyone told them to pretend, but because the system rewards consistency. And consistency, in this context, means emotional predictability, positivity, gratitude, composure. Anything else is labeled as misalignment, so they learn to filter. The anger gets reshaped into ambition. The sadness becomes discipline. The anxiety becomes overpreparedness. Everything is translated into performance. And for a while, it works. On paper, everything looks fine, better than fine, impressive. But inside, things start to flatten. The internal world becomes quieter. Not peaceful, just muted. Experiences lose texture. Emotions lose weight. Moments pass quickly. Nothing sticks. They're still succeeding, but they're no longer arriving. Each day is filled with tasks, interactions, achievements, but none of them feel fully inhabited. They're lived through, but not lived in. There's a sense of distance, a sense that things are happening in front of them, not to them. And yet, nothing looks wrong, so no one asks, and they don't offer, because the expectation has already been set. They're the one who's figured it out, the one who made it, the one who doesn't need help. Not anymore. Not really. This creates a kind of emotional starvation. Needs don't stop existing just because they stop being voiced. They go underground, and when they do, they turn into something harder to name. A dull ache, a vague discomfort, an emptiness that doesn't respond to logic. They try to fix it, with more work, more goals, more structure. But those things only reinforce the system that created the silence in the first place. The architecture of success is maintained, but the person inside it begins to disappear. They stop reaching out, not because no one cares, but because they can't explain what's wrong. There's no obvious crisis, no clear narrative, just the slow erosion of inner space, a hollowing that doesn't leave a mark. And when, on rare occasions, they try to speak about it, the responses fall short. Not because others are cruel, but because others are confused. What could someone like that be struggling with? They have everything. And so the moment passes, and the silence grows deeper. Eventually, they stop trying. They master the art of appearing okay, of sounding motivated, of being fine. And the more convincing the performance becomes, the more invisible the truth gets. They're not faking. They're surviving. They're not lying. They're protecting. Because to say it out loud would require rewriting everything people believe about them. And they don't want to lose that story. So they keep telling it. And no one corrects it. Because from the outside, there's nothing to fix. You worked so hard to be taken seriously that you forgot how to be soft. In systems where competence is currency, softness is rarely seen as an asset. It's tolerated in limited forms, kindness framed as leadership, vulnerability framed as authenticity, but rarely allowed in its raw state. People who move through the world with strength are rewarded. Those who hold things together under pressure are respected. And over time, this structure teaches people what parts of themselves to emphasize and what to suppress. It starts with small choices. A moment of hesitation is replaced with a firm answer. A question is rephrased to sound more certain. A feeling is translated into a strategy. None of this feels like betrayal. It feels like alignment. The system wants clarity, confidence, capability. So that's what's offered. Again and again. Eventually, the individual becomes fluent in strength. They speak in concise sentences. They offer solutions. They anticipate objections. They perform control, not out of deception, but out of habit, because it works, because it's efficient, because softness, in comparison, feels too slow, too uncertain, too hard to explain. But what they don't realize, until much later, is that strength, when overused, becomes armor. And armor doesn't come off easily, especially when it's been mistaken for identity. This is not about denial. The person knows they have emotions. They know they're human. But somewhere along the line, softness stopped being something they expressed. It became something they manage. Even joy is regulated, not out of fear, but out of calibration. Too much softness disrupts the frame. It doesn't scale. It doesn't translate. So it gets trimmed. This pattern spreads. Conversations become efficient. Gestures become calculated. Reactions become measured. Everything that doesn't serve the image of stability is muted. The person becomes reliable, respected, sought after, but not reached. Because no one can reach someone who doesn't show what they need. And the person doesn't show. Not because they don't want to, but because they've forgotten how. They forgot what it's like to express something without translating it first. To admit confusion without softening the blow. To cry without apology. To say, I need, without bracing for judgment. And when those moments try to surface, when the body aches for softness, they're dismissed. Reframed. Postponed. Not now. Not here. Not with them. So softness becomes a secret, not hidden by force, hidden by lack of use. It fades from language, from posture, from memory, until the person starts to believe that maybe they were never soft to begin with, that maybe the armor is who they are. This belief doesn't cause collapse. It causes detachment. The person continues functioning. They continue performing. But the range of experience narrows. They know what to do in a crisis, in a deadline, in a negotiation. But in stillness, they struggle. Stillness asks questions they don't know how to answer. Like, what do you feel? And what would you say if no one needed you to be strong? And who are you when you're not performing stability? These questions don't arrive loudly. They whisper, in the quiet moments, in the pauses between obligations, in the seconds before sleep. And when they're ignored, they don't disappear. They just sit, waiting, pressing, dull, but persistent. Eventually, the person realizes something disorienting. They've become unrecognizable to themselves, not because they changed, but because they hardened, and the hardening worked. But now they don't know how to reverse it. They don't know how to soften without unraveling. They don't know how to express without explaining. They don't know how to feel without fixing. So they continue, strong, composed, respected, and quietly disconnected. You became so focused on making the right decisions that you forgot how to feel what you want. Decision-making is often framed as the highest expression of autonomy, the ability to choose well, to plan effectively, to weigh trade-offs and minimize regret. This becomes the cornerstone of functional adulthood, especially in high-performing systems. Decisions are everything. Metrics follow them. Outcomes reflect them. Entire identities are built on being known as someone who makes good choices. And so it starts early. The individual learns to pause before they act, to evaluate, to anticipate, to analyze. This is not harmful. In fact, it's often praised. But something else happens alongside it. As the ability to make decisions becomes more refined, the instinct to simply want something begins to atrophy. Over time, preference becomes suspect. It is no longer treated as a source of direction. It is treated as a variable, something to test, validate, optimize. If the preference can be defended, it stays. If not, it's discarded. Emotion becomes a data point. Intuition becomes noise unless it can be justified. And gradually, the distance between feeling and choosing grows wider. The person learns not to ask, "What do I want?" Instead, they ask, "What makes the most sense? What leads to the best outcome? What will I regret the least? What aligns with the long-term vision?" These are not bad questions, but they are questions designed to protect, not to connect. What disappears in the process is access to the self as a source of truth. The internal world becomes secondary to the map being constructed outside of it. Life starts to feel like a series of paths to navigate rather than an experience to inhabit. When desire shows up without a clear function, when it doesn't fit the model, it is viewed with suspicion. Spontaneity becomes threatening. Wanting something without a reason feels irresponsible. And so they wait for more data, for confirmation, for alignment, until the wanting itself dies down. This becomes a habit, a structure, a protective mechanism. The person avoids mistakes. They make efficient use of time. They are praised for their clarity. But inside, a disconnection begins to build. Decisions are still made, but they are no longer animated by anything felt. There is movement, but no momentum. Progress, but no presence. Clarity, but no intimacy. The person is admired for their discernment, but they themselves start to feel like a machine running decision trees. Everything is evaluated. Every choice is filtered through risk and return. Even small questions, what to eat, who to talk to, where to go, become micro-optimizations. They no longer know how to move toward something simply because it feels alive. They begin to notice this most in moments of pause, when there is no deadline, no urgent task, just time, space, and in that space, something should emerge. A preference, a pull, a desire. But it doesn't. There is only calculation. What would make the most of this time? What should I be doing? What would be smartest? The absence of felt desire is not interpreted as a warning. It's interpreted as discipline. That's the trap. The system rewards suppression that looks like wisdom. And so the person continues to make all the right decisions. But the self behind those decisions fades. This disconnection is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself as burnout or crisis. It appears subtly, as indifference, as numbness, as a low-level resistance to choice itself. Even pleasure becomes complicated. It is judged, measured, compared. Was that really worth it? Should I have done something else? Is this contributing to something meaningful? The moment doesn't get to stand on its own. It's always followed by evaluation. This creates a kind of inner sterility. Nothing grows unless it's proven. Nothing is pursued unless it fits. Desire without evidence is abandoned. And over time, the person forgets how to want anything unconditionally. This affects relationships. Instead of emotional resonance, they pursue compatibility. Instead of excitement, they seek stability. Instead of intimacy, they seek predictability. The relationships function, but feel limited. Nothing is surrendered. Everything is negotiated. It affects self-perception. The person views themselves as an evolving system of inputs and outcomes. They adapt. They grow. But they don't feel grounded, because grounding requires preference, and preference is no longer trusted. At some point, they realize they're tired, not from work, from constantly having to explain everything they feel, and from only letting themselves feel what can be explained. They begin to long for moments of instinct, for the chance to say, "I don't know why, but I want this." But they can't, because they've built a life where decisions must be correct, and wanting is never enough. So they delay. They postpone feeling until it's rational. They postpone desire until it makes sense. And when it doesn't, when nothing shows up that's both true and useful, they default to neutrality. That neutrality is mistaken for peace. But it's not peace. It's absence. It's the result of decision-making that no longer includes the person making the decision. And that's the final cost. They've optimized every choice, but forgotten how to want anything. You got so good at moving on that you stopped processing anything. Modern success often requires momentum. Projects move quickly. Expectations compound. Attention spans shrink. There is little room for slowing down, and even less room for looking back. In this system, moving on is rewarded. Recovery is rushed. Reflection is abbreviated. And over time, this becomes a way of living. The person learns that staying too long with discomfort makes them inefficient. That processing pain is a risk to stability. That lingering emotions make others uncomfortable and themselves unreliable. So they get better at moving on. Not dramatically, just quietly. They stop lingering on what can't be changed. They stop repeating what didn't work. They let things go fast. At first, this seems like growth. They bounce back quickly. They don't dwell. They don't get stuck. When things go wrong, they recalibrate. When people disappoint them, they adjust. When plans fail, they pivot. Each time, the system praises their resilience. But something begins to disappear in the process. Unprocessed experiences don't vanish. They compress. The person moves forward, but the emotional residue of what happened stays behind. It doesn't scream. It settles, becomes background noise, becomes habit, becomes a version of the self that is incrementally shaped by events that were never understood, only avoided. The loss is subtle. They don't notice it immediately. Why would they? The surface stays intact. The tasks get done. The responses are appropriate. But internally, something starts to feel missing. The emotional range flattens. Joy doesn't reach as far. Sadness doesn't sink as deep. Curiosity doesn't wander. The texture of life thins. Because emotion that isn't processed doesn't just disappear. It calcifies. It turns into assumptions, patterns, defenses. The person starts protecting themselves from things they never named. They start avoiding things they never explored. They start reacting to situations with intensity that doesn't match the moment. Not because they're fragile, but because past injuries are still running in the background, unacknowledged. When asked how they're doing, the answers are polished. Not dishonest, just filtered. They've learned what to say. They've learned what sounds responsible, what sounds mature, what sounds evolved. They've also learned what doesn't work: vulnerability without a solution, sadness without a timeline, confusion without context. So they stop showing those things. And eventually, they stop showing them even to themselves. It's not denial. It's a kind of emotional efficiency. Why feel something fully if it's not going to change the outcome? Why revisit pain if it can't be resolved? Why admit regret if you can't undo the choice? This logic seems sound until it spreads, and it spreads everywhere. Into relationships where conflict is avoided not through resolution, but through detachment. Into memory where past experiences are reduced to takeaways rather than explored as stories. Into the body where tension builds slowly from feelings that were never given names. The person begins to live inside a structure that works, but does not respond. They've become functional, but they've also become disconnected. They make decisions based on what's next, not on what's unfinished. They assume healing is happening simply because time is passing. But time doesn't process emotions. Attention does. And the attention hasn't been given. Not because the person is cold, but because the system they live in taught them that reflection is indulgent. That emotion is distraction. That slowing down is falling behind. So they keep moving until something stops them. Sometimes it's illness. Sometimes it's loss. Sometimes it's nothing, just a moment of silence that feels unbearable. Because in that silence, everything they moved past is still waiting, still unresolved, still shaping them. At that point, they realize that moving on was never the solution. It was a delay. That unfinished emotions don't expire. They embed. That what they skipped didn't disappear. It just changed form. And now they're left with a backlog of things they can't name. They don't need therapy. They need time. Not time to collapse, but time to feel. To uncompress what was rushed. To name what was denied. To process what was postponed. But the system doesn't allow that. So they make a choice. To continue moving. Or to finally stop. And remember, you learn to outsmart your emotions. And now you don't trust what you feel. In high-functioning environments, intelligence is often treated as the primary solution to discomfort. Emotional pain is not ignored, but it is managed intellectually. When something hurts, the first instinct is not to feel, it's to explain. When something's unclear, the instinct is not to explore, it's to model. The ability to regulate emotions becomes indistinguishable from the ability to suppress them. Not through denial, but through analysis. The person becomes good at describing what's happening. They know the language. They reference attachment theory, nervous system responses, cognitive distortions. Their vocabulary is strong. Their explanations are compelling. But over time, something starts to shift. The explanations replace the experience. The emotion is still there, but it is narrated so quickly and so thoroughly that it never fully arrives. It's not that they don't feel. It's that every feeling is filtered through a cognitive framework the moment it shows up. The moment sadness surfaces, they scan it. What triggered this? What belief is driving this? Is it rational? Is it consistent with past patterns? What should I learn from it? By the time they finish that loop, the sadness is gone. Not processed, just overruled. This pattern becomes automatic. It starts as a strength, emotional regulation, but becomes a defense. The person doesn't cry. They observe themselves not crying and consider why that might be. They don't rage. They evaluate their frustration, wondering if it's linked to an old wound. They don't love freely. They examine the impulse, looking for signs of codependency or enmeshment. They call this insight. But insight without emotion is just distance. Eventually, they begin to notice the cost. Their decisions are correct, but hollow. Their relationships are stable, but impersonal. Their inner world is organized, but numb. They can explain everything, but they don't feel inside any of it. This isn't apathy. It's detachment by design. They designed it to stay safe, to stay in control, to stay functional. The irony is that this strategy often works. They don't fall apart. They don't lash out. They don't collapse under pressure. They perform. They succeed. And no one questions them. Because from the outside, They look like the most emotionally intelligent person in the room. But emotional intelligence is not emotional suppression, and regulation without connection is not healing. This becomes evident in moments of silence, in the hours where there is no demand to perform, no urgency to solve, just space. That space should be peaceful, but instead, it feels hollow, because there is nothing in it that hasn't been optimized. Even rest has a purpose. Even pleasure has a lesson. The person tries to re-engage with emotion. They journal. They reflect. They try to locate feeling. But what comes up first is thought. Always thought. Thought is safer, cleaner, easier to control. Emotion doesn't follow rules, and they only trust what can be reasoned with. That's the trap. They've trained themselves to believe that emotion needs a reason, that it must be consistent with their goals, that it must fit into their narrative. And when it doesn't, they override it. They can't cry unless they understand why. They can't feel joy unless it makes sense. They can't be angry unless it's justified. And if a feeling shows up that doesn't meet those conditions, it gets paused, reframed, analyzed, and eventually forgotten. But forgotten isn't gone. Unfelt emotions don't disappear. They accumulate. They show up in tension, in irritability, in distraction, in chronic fatigue. The body starts carrying what the mind refuses to hold. And the body doesn't argue. It just signals, over and over, until the person starts to notice that something is off. They're not depressed, but they're not alive. They're not broken, but they're not present. Everything is fine, but nothing feels real. And when they try to explain it, the words fail, because the problem isn't conceptual. It's relational. They've lost their relationship with feeling. They've built a system where logic runs everything. And logic is excellent at explaining, but terrible at experiencing. At some point, they realize they've become emotionally fluent, but emotionally unavailable, even to themselves. And now they don't know how to come back. Because coming back means trusting what can't be proven. It means feeling things they can't explain. It means surrendering to confusion. And that feels like failure. So they hesitate. They scan again. They look for a reason to feel. And still nothing arrives. Because feeling was never about reason. And they forgot that. You measured everything you did, until you forgot how to do anything without measuring it. In performance-oriented systems, measurement is reassurance. If something can be tracked, it feels real. If it can be quantified, it feels justified. The act of measuring turns experience into output. It turns decisions into data. And over time, that shift becomes a structure that informs every action. At first, the habit is useful. Tracking inputs and outputs provides clarity. It builds awareness. You see how time is spent, how energy is allocated, how effort correlates with results. The process feels empowering. Nothing is wasted. Everything can be accounted for. But the more consistent the measurement becomes, the more the behavior begins to shift. The person stops doing things for how they feel and starts doing them for how they can be tracked. Joy becomes productivity. Rest becomes recovery. Connection becomes networking. Curiosity becomes research. None of these changes are harmful in isolation, but together, they create a framework where action must produce a measurable return to be considered valid. And once that standard is internalized, something essential starts to erode: the ability to engage with experience for its own sake. The person becomes unable to act without justification. They want to go for a walk, but only if it counts as exercise. They want to read a book, but only if it teaches something. They want to talk to someone, but only if it leads to insight or resolution. Every action must lead to something else. And the value of that action is measured in what it produces, not what it contains. Eventually, they begin to lose contact with intrinsic motivation. The internal compass fades. It's replaced by metrics, outcomes, performance indicators. Even internal experiences are logged and scored. Was that productive? Was that efficient? Was that aligned? This language becomes internalized. It becomes the lens through which every moment is evaluated. The person begins to think in frameworks, to speak in deliverables, to move in cycles of optimization. And when something doesn't yield data, it feels like failure. But most of life doesn't yield data. Conversations don't yield data. Silence doesn't yield data. Grief doesn't yield data. A random laugh, a quiet sunset, a strange dream, none of these things produce anything trackable. And so they begin to fade. They're not eliminated directly. They're just not prioritized, not included, not scheduled. And slowly, life becomes measurable, but sterile. The emotional consequence is subtle. It doesn't register as suffering. It registers as disconnection. There's no breakdown. There's no crisis. There's just a growing gap between what is done and what is felt. The person keeps acting, but the actions don't land. They execute, but they no longer inhabit. Even success feels incomplete, because success that isn't felt is just data. And the person can't feel success unless it aligns with the metric they've chosen to measure it by, which means that even wins are conditional. Even satisfaction is calculated. Eventually, they begin to wonder, what would I do if it didn't have to count? What would I choose if I weren't tracking? What would I care about if I weren't optimizing? And the answer doesn't come easily, because the muscle of intrinsic preference has atrophied. Everything has been filtered through measurement for so long that the original signal is buried. This affects creativity. Nothing can be made unless it's useful. Nothing can be explored unless it's monetized. Nothing can be expressed unless it meets a standard. The joy of invention is replaced by the weight of relevance. It affects relationships. People are treated as functions. Conversations are filtered through goals. Vulnerability is translated into emotional literacy, not intimacy. The human is replaced by the productive. It affects time. Days are divided into units. Schedules are optimized. Downtime is categorized as recovery, not as existence. There is no space for moments that lead nowhere, for experiences that don't scale. And it affects identity. The person stops being someone who lives and becomes someone who performs, and performs, and performs, until one day they realize they don't know how to spend time without measuring it. They don't know how to talk without optimizing the outcome. They don't know how to feel without evaluating it. They don't know how to be unless they're becoming something measurable. And what began as clarity became captivity, because measurement, when it replaces meaning, becomes a trap. You built your confidence on competence, and now you collapse when you're uncertain. Confidence is often misunderstood. People assume it means self-belief, a kind of internal strength that stays constant across situations. But most high-functioning individuals don't build confidence that way. They build it through competence, through doing well, again and again, through delivering, through being right, through solving problems faster than most people even see them coming. This kind of confidence is powerful. It's durable. It works in high-pressure systems. It performs well under expectations. But it has a weakness, a hidden one, because it's not really confidence. It's conditional certainty. It's the feeling that arises when outcomes can be controlled. And when that control disappears, so does the confidence. This shift is not visible at first, because most of the time, competence is present. The person performs well. They're praised for how quickly they learn, how clearly they speak, how decisively they act. There is no reason to question their inner foundation, and they don't either until it fails. It fails in moments of uncertainty, when the rules change, when the outcome isn't guaranteed, when the situation exceeds their training. And suddenly, something happens that shouldn't be difficult, but is. They hesitate. They overthink. They second-guess. And that pause doesn't just feel like a momentary lapse. It feels like exposure. They're not just confused. They feel like they've been stripped of the very thing that kept them upright competence. This reaction is not about the problem they're facing. It's about what they believe uncertainty says about them. They've internalized the idea that confusion equals inadequacy, that uncertainty equals incompetence. That doubt is something to fix, not something to understand. And so they spiral. They try to find the fastest path back to clarity. They search for information. They compare themselves to others. They rehearse every angle, not to learn, but to erase the discomfort of not knowing. Because not knowing feels like losing identity. They are the one who figures things out, who gets things done, who understands. And now, they don't. So who are they? This is where the deeper damage begins. The person starts avoiding uncertainty, not explicitly, but behaviorally. They gravitate toward problems they can solve, toward environments where they shine, toward people who already respect them. They call it focus. They call it efficiency. But underneath, it's fear. Fear of being revealed as someone who doesn't always know what to do. They stop taking risks, not out of laziness, out of preservation. Because failure doesn't just cost time or reputation, it threatens identity. They narrow their range. They become exceptional at a few things, but they start to deteriorate at everything else. Not because they're incapable, but because they've stopped practicing being uncomfortable. They've stopped tolerating the one thing that makes growth possible, not knowing. This creates a paradox. On paper, they look more competent than ever, but inside, they're more fragile than they've ever been. Because the moment something breaks their rhythm, they don't bend. They freeze. They overcompensate. They try to reclaim control. They speak with too much certainty. They double down on the last thing that worked. They move too fast, not because they're sure, but because they're scared of what happens when they slow down and realize they're not. Over time, this becomes a pattern. Confidence is only accessible when performance is perfect. And when it's not, they disappear. They withdraw. They isolate. They wait until they feel competent again before re-entering. Because their presence was never built on being. It was built on knowing. And when knowing falters, presence vanishes. You became a master of managing expectations, and now you can't handle genuine disappointment. Expectation management is a common strategy among high-functioning individuals. It begins as a useful practice, setting realistic timelines, clarifying outcomes, reducing the risk of failure. It creates consistency. It makes teams run smoother. It protects relationships from breakdowns. Over time, it becomes a way to control emotional volatility, both in others and in oneself. And it works. For a while, it becomes so effective that disappointment nearly disappears. Deadlines are met because buffers were built in. Reactions are muted because expectations were carefully lowered. Risks are pre-managed before they become threats. This system doesn't just keep things operational, it prevents collapse. It turns uncertainty into something navigable. But something subtle begins to change beneath the surface. The absence of disappointment is interpreted as a success. And in measurable terms, it is. Projects are stable. Feedback is positive. Outcomes align with forecasts. But emotionally, something is happening. The person starts losing contact with how to respond when disappointment does come, because it eventually does. When it finally arrives, it doesn't feel proportional. It feels destabilizing, not because the event is catastrophic, but because the emotional tools needed to face it were replaced by structures built to avoid it. The person didn't fail to prepare. They prepared so well that they never practiced recovering. Disappointment becomes harder to process not because it's bigger, but because it's unfamiliar. This is the paradox in managing expectations to avoid chaos. The person also avoided developing the capacity to handle letdown without control. They removed themselves from the emotional variability of real life. Everything they do is buffered, explained, forecasted, and when something escapes the model, it hits harder than it should. The emotional reaction is disproportionate. They shut down, not because the situation is extreme, but because they no longer trust themselves to feel that kind of loss without breaking their internal structure. They start overcorrecting. They lower expectations to the point of emotional disengagement. They minimize ambition. They undercommit, not out of laziness, but to protect themselves from future impact. Success feels safer when it's surrounded by disclaimers. Hope feels dangerous when it's unguarded. Eventually, they lose the ability to fully want things, because wanting something too much makes disappointment unbearable. So they stop wanting fully. They tell themselves they're being realistic, that they're mature, that they're grounded. But what they've really done is disconnect their desire from their emotional investment. The result is muted. They go after things, but half-heartedly. They plan, but don't attach. They speak about goals with the language of strategy, not longing. And it works, until something matters, really matters, and they don't know how to let it. They feel the impulse to protect, to manage, to lower, to frame. But they also sense the cost, the dullness, the absence of intensity, the lack of contact with anything that feels like deep care. Because care can't be moderated through expectation. Care arrives full, and full care makes space for full disappointment. But they've trained themselves to avoid that, because at some point in the past, disappointment felt like failure, like regression, like exposure. And ever since, they've built systems to prevent it from happening again. Systems that include preparing for the worst to avoid emotional drop, never showing too much excitement to stay composed, mentally rehearsing negative outcomes so they're not surprised, taking responsibility before anything goes wrong, distancing from outcomes by saying they were never that invested. All of these are designed to preserve self-image, but they also erode emotional availability. Over time, they realize they've become excellent at managing scenarios, but fragile in the face of true disappointment. And they've structured their life so efficiently that they've left no room for disappointment to be absorbed, only predicted or avoided. Eventually, they ask the question, what happens if I let myself actually want something? And the answer feels dangerous, because if they let themselves want, they become vulnerable. And vulnerability is something their system no longer accommodates. So they continue managing and lose the ability to feel fully. You became so good at anticipating reactions that you lost touch with what you actually think. There is a difference between having thoughts and predicting reactions. One is about inner clarity. The other is about social calibration. Most high-functioning individuals are trained, formally or informally, to prioritize the second, to consider how a statement will land before they speak, to weigh the likely interpretations before forming a position, to adapt tone, content, timing, and expression so that the response they receive matches the outcome they need. It begins with awareness. In group settings, they notice how people react to different types of language. In professional situations, they learn the political weight of word choice. In personal relationships, they understand how vulnerability is read, not as a signal of authenticity, but as something to manage. And so, without realizing it, they develop a skill, anticipating reactions. It's not manipulation. It's risk mitigation. It's an effort to maintain stability of mood, of relationship, of consequence. But as this skill strengthens, something else begins to weaken, the ability to hold a thought without adjusting it for the audience. Eventually, they stop thinking privately. Even in their own mind, thoughts are pre-processed. Before a belief can fully form, it is checked for social viability. Before an opinion can take shape, it is compared against potential reactions. Before they say anything, even to themselves, they edit. This becomes the new normal. They stop asking, what do I really think? They start asking, what version of this will be received the best? And because they're good at it, it works. They speak with polish. They present nuance. They handle conflict delicately. They gain trust. But the trade-off is subtle. They are no longer thinking, they are performing thought. Over time, this changes how they experience reality. They don't move through life interpreting events directly. They move through life forecasting interpretation. They become hyper-attuned to how others might frame what's happening. They start to see themselves not as the subject, but as a narrator of their own position. Their role is not to feel and speak. It is to manage response. This affects relationships. Conversations lose depth, not because they're superficial, but because they're filtered. They reveal only what serves the dynamic. They express only what advances the exchange. Honesty becomes a calculation. It affects creativity. Ideas are generated not from exploration, but from utility. Expression is shaped by audience retention, virality, or brand alignment. Even in solitude, the imagined gaze of others sits on every draft. It affects memory. Experiences are recalled not as raw moments, but as rehearsed explanations. Even personal stories begin to sound like summaries. The emotion fades. The clarity sharpens. Most of all, it affects identity. The person begins to lose track of what they think, not because they lack opinion, but because every opinion has been optimized, adjusted, sanded down for frictionless delivery. When they finally try to speak freely, perhaps in a private space, perhaps in writing, they hesitate, not because there's a risk of conflict, but because they can't find the unfiltered version of the thought anymore. The internal editor has become so integrated that the original signal no longer arrives. They don't trust the first version of anything. They need to scan it, smooth it, recast it, and eventually, it disappears. That disappearance doesn't cause panic. It causes flatness, a loss of emotional engagement with ideas, a sense that everything they say is technically true, but somehow hollow, a sense that even their strongest beliefs feel rehearsed. They become harder to surprise, harder to provoke, harder to reach, not because they are closed, but because they are constantly managing the space between thought and expression, and no one can touch them there. Eventually, they begin to ask, if I didn't have to explain this, what would I say? And they don't know, because they've built a life where explanation comes first. And now, expression can't happen without it. You spent so long trying to fix yourself that you stopped noticing what was never broken. Self-improvement is framed as responsibility, to reflect, to grow, to repair, to correct. And for high-functioning individuals, it often becomes the default framework for existence. Any discomfort is seen as a signal of something unprocessed. Any struggle is interpreted as a problem of mindset, behavior, or belief. The self becomes a system, and every glitch is assumed to be a flaw in the code. It starts small. A moment of anxiety becomes a prompt to analyze your attachment style. A conflict triggers a breakdown of communication habits. A missed opportunity leads to an audit of mindset blocks. None of this is wrong. None of it is harmful in isolation. But when applied constantly, without rest, it becomes a filter that reclassifies every experience as an error to solve. Over time, the individual begins to see their own humanity as a malfunction. Tired, you must have poor boundaries. Sad, you're probably resisting something. Angry, there's a childhood wound resurfacing. Confused, you haven't integrated the lesson yet. The language becomes second nature. It sounds intelligent, responsible, even evolved, but something else happens underneath it. The person stops trusting ordinary emotion. Everything becomes a signal of something deeper. Everything is suspect. They no longer feel things directly. They interrogate them. Why am I feeling this? What's the lesson here? What needs to be released? Even joy gets filtered. They ask if it's too dependent on external validation, if it's rooted in ego, if it's sustainable. They stop being in the experience. They start managing it. This mindset turns selfhood into a continuous audit, and audits don't rest. This doesn't cause collapse. It causes fatigue, not just physical, but existential, because the person no longer knows how to be. They only know how to monitor. They no longer feel at home in themselves. They feel like they're constantly under construction. Eventually, they begin to over-identify with the parts of themselves that need work. The moments of strength feel like exceptions. The moments of struggle feel like the truth, because struggle has been coded as honest, as real, as something to dig into. And so they keep digging, even when they're exhausted, even when nothing is wrong, even when the only reason they're still working on themselves is because they forgot how to stop. They don't know how to sit inside an emotion without trying to trace its origin. They don't know how to hear criticism without deconstructing it. They don't know how to celebrate a win without checking if it's aligned. Everything must be examined. Everything must be improved. Nothing is allowed to simply exist. And the cost is cumulative. They begin to lose the ability to feel peace without explanation, to feel okay without reason, to feel whole, even while still growing. Because the framework they're operating in has a built-in flaw. It assumes that what is unhealed is what is most true. And so they live in permanent relationship with the broken parts, even when those parts no longer need fixing, even when the healing has already happened. They still go looking, because that's what they've trained themselves to do. The self becomes a project, not a person, a task, not a presence. And eventually, they reach a point where the tools of self-improvement are the very thing blocking self-acceptance. They aren't helping anymore. They're preventing rest. They're preventing integration. They're preventing recognition of everything that was already fine. Because healing isn't always about what's missing. Sometimes it's about noticing what never needed to be changed. But they can't see that, because they're too busy diagnosing everything that feels even slightly off. And in doing so, they lose the ability to be, to exist, to settle, to trust. They are not broken, but they've been living as if they were. And they've gotten so good at fixing themselves. They don't know how to stop. You trained yourself to always be useful. And now you don't know what to do when you're not needed. In high-functioning environments, usefulness becomes identity. The more value a person brings, the more secure they feel. The relationship is transactional, but not externally. It's internal. A person begins to equate being wanted with being worthy, being efficient with being important, being relied upon with being real. This belief doesn't come from ego. It comes from structure. Systems reward usefulness. And over time, that reward becomes expectation, not just from others, but from the self. It starts with reliability. The person delivers. They show up. They take ownership. They get things done. Others begin to depend on them. And that dependence creates a loop. The more people depend on them, the more they feel anchored in the system. Their role becomes defined not by who they are, but by what they can solve. This isn't visible at first. It looks like responsibility. It sounds like leadership. It functions like maturity. But underneath, something is shifting. The person is not building an identity. They're performing a function. And that function becomes permanent, not through words, but through patterns. Eventually, they become indispensable, but not as a person, as a utility. And the moment they're not needed, they disappear. Not literally, but psychologically, because their internal narrative is built on contribution. And when contribution is not requested, their existence feels optional. They don't know how to just be. They know how to support, to fix, to anticipate, to manage. But when the situation is calm, when nothing is broken, when no one needs anything, they become anxious. They try to offer something: advice, presence, input, resources. They do it subtly, thoughtfully, quietly. But if nothing is taken, they begin to panic. Not visibly, internally, because they've built their self-worth on being useful. And now there's no demand. Which means, in their mind, there's no reason to be here. This realization doesn't cause a breakdown. It causes withdrawal. They start to distance themselves from spaces where they can't contribute. They avoid relationships that don't need them. They stop participating in events where their presence doesn't serve a clear purpose. They say they're being efficient. What they're actually doing is protecting their identity. Because if they enter a room and offer nothing, they feel like nothing. This shows up in rest. They can't rest unless it prepares them to be useful later. Leisure is tolerated only if it boosts future output. Even hobbies are reframed as skills. Everything they do must justify its existence by what it produces. And if it doesn't, they can't do it. Or worse, they do it, but they feel guilty the entire time. It shows up in relationships. They don't know how to be part of someone's life unless they're solving something, supporting something, offering something. If the other person doesn't need them, they feel invisible. So they overfunction. Quietly. They insert help. They scan for pain. They make themselves useful. And if the help isn't accepted, they interpret it as rejection. Not because they need validation, because they need to exist. And their only model for existence is to serve. Eventually, this becomes a trap. They avoid spaces where they can't shine. They avoid people who don't express need. They avoid feelings that don't lead to solutions. And they avoid themselves when there's nothing left to fix. Because the empty space, the stillness, the absence of demand, it terrifies them. It suggests they are optional. And they don't know how to tolerate that. So they work harder, offer more, try again, until burnout arrives. But they don't see it as burnout. They see it as failure. Because usefulness is supposed to be endless. They're supposed to always be able to offer something. And now they can't. So they don't just feel tired. They feel erased. You focus so much on becoming who you're supposed to be that you forgot who you used to be without trying. In achievement-driven systems, the idea of becoming is always present. You are supposed to develop, to upgrade, to refine, to shed your previous limitations and emerge more capable, more confident, more optimized. Every step forward is treated as progress. Every layer added as improvement. Stagnation is seen as failure. Reflection is only permitted if it leads to correction. And so, over time, the self becomes a project, an ongoing renovation with no endpoint. You begin with goals. Maybe it's to be more productive, more emotionally intelligent, more socially adaptable. You start to eliminate behaviors that don't fit the new model. You reshape your language. You regulate your reactions. You modify your presentation, not because you're being fake, but because you're trying to evolve. And for a while, it works. You get better results. You gain access to more rooms. More people respond positively. You feel like you're building something solid. But what you don't notice is that each improvement quietly replaces a piece of something older, something original. You used to speak more freely, before you learned what not to say. You used to ask questions without knowing if they were smart. You used to feel things without trying to understand or regulate them. You used to laugh, not because it was well-timed, but because something caught you off guard. Now, all of that is gone. Not in a dramatic way. It didn't vanish overnight. It was shaved off slowly, over years of self-correction. You told yourself you were maturing, but what you were actually doing was narrowing the range of your identity. You stopped doing things that couldn't be justified. You stopped thinking in ways that didn't align. You stopped feeling what didn't match the version you were building. Eventually, you started asking not what feels right, but what fits, what works, what looks consistent, what sounds credible. And the answer came easily, because you already knew the model you were following. It was based on feedback, on reward, on stability, on outcome. But it wasn't based on you. Not the version of you that existed before you began managing yourself. And now you don't remember that version. You remember traits, preferences, past behaviors, but not the actual experience of being that person. Because that version wasn't organized. It wasn't branded. It didn't have structure. It just was. And you don't know how to go back to that. Because your entire identity is now organized around becoming. You move from phase to phase, always identifying what needs to be addressed next. You journal to track progress. You reflect only to optimize. You set intentions, but only ones that fit your trajectory. You don't just want to feel something. You want to know what that feeling says about your growth. You don't just want to make decisions. You want to know how they map onto your value system. Even your private thoughts are edited. You watch them pass by and ask whether they're aligned with who you say you are. This isn't self-awareness. It's a surveillance state you've installed in your own mind. A system that rewards you every time you reinforce the model and punishes you with discomfort every time you deviate. The discomfort isn't loud. It's subtle. It arrives as tension, as hesitation, as quiet doubt that you're slipping somehow, losing coherence, getting off track. And so you return to the plan, to the frame, to the identity you built, because it works, until it doesn't, until one day you realize that your preferences have stopped evolving, that your curiosity has shrunk, that your emotions feel rehearsed, that your goals feel obligatory. You start to wonder, what would I be doing if I wasn't trying to be someone? And the answer doesn't come, because you haven't asked that question in years. You've only asked, what's next? What needs improvement? What doesn't fit? What hasn't been healed? What should be removed? And those questions never end. They loop, because becoming doesn't stop. And the model you've built requires constant input. You can't rest, because rest is unproductive. You can't play, because play is inefficient. You can't feel, because feelings are messy and can't be tracked. So you keep building, you keep becoming, you keep refining, until one day, you stop and realize you have no idea who you are when you're not trying. And the absence doesn't feel empty. It feels unfamiliar, because it's been too long since you've done anything without asking if it makes sense. You don't just want to be yourself anymore. You want to understand why that self is worth keeping. But the more you look for answers inside your framework, the more you realize that the framework wasn't built to house you. It was built to house a better version of you. And now you've filled that space so well that there's no room left for anything uncertain, anything playful, anything wild, anything human. What's left is you, perfectly filtered, perfectly managed, and completely disconnected. You prioritized clarity in everything until ambiguity became intolerable. Clarity is commonly regarded as a strength. In education, in leadership, in personal relationships, the ability to articulate, define, and explain is treated as both admirable and necessary. In this framework, uncertainty is not neutral. It is treated as a defect, something to be corrected, avoided, or resolved. Over time, a person who consistently seeks clarity will begin to internalize ambiguity not as a natural condition of reality, but as a personal failure to control their environment. It starts with language. You become more precise. You use fewer words. You remove anything that could be misinterpreted. You anticipate confusion and eliminate it before it surfaces. You ask questions not to understand, but to pin things down. The goal becomes to reduce the range of possible interpretations in any situation. This begins as a form of efficiency. Eventually, it becomes the lens through which all interaction is filtered. You start to structure your internal thoughts the same way. If a feeling arises that doesn't lead to a conclusion, it is discarded. If a question doesn't have a direct path to resolution, it is postponed or framed differently. The mind is repurposed from a space for exploration into a space for decision-making. You no longer view unformed ideas as possibilities. You see them as unfinished work, tasks to be completed, problems to be solved. This is rewarded. People respond better to clarity than to uncertainty. They feel safer when someone speaks with certainty. They follow leadership that is structured, not exploratory. And so your social environment adjusts to your habits. You become the person who always knows. And once that identity is assigned, it becomes hard to let go of. You stop expressing doubt, not because it's dangerous, but because it's inconsistent with the version of yourself you've already shown to others. Over time, ambiguity begins to feel physically uncomfortable. You can't tolerate unstructured conversation. You lose patience with people who speak without getting to the point. You avoid topics that don't resolve. You avoid emotions that can't be clearly categorized. The ability to stay in tension without collapsing is reduced. Not because you've become fragile, but because you've over-optimized your internal processes for closure. Eventually, the habit generalizes. You stop reading fiction unless it has clear philosophical or technical utility. You avoid movies that don't resolve clearly. You tune out of conversations that meander or explore nuance. You avoid people who speak in emotional language without specificity. Your attention span isn't damaged. It's rerouted, trained to only engage with things that end in understanding. Anything that exists to simply be observed is discarded as inefficient. This starts to affect your thinking in ways that aren't obvious. You begin to mistake clarity for truth. You assume that what's easier to articulate is more correct, that what's simpler to explain is more accurate, that what fits neatly into categories is inherently more valid. The ambiguity of real life is treated as a design flaw, rather than as a normal state. Eventually, this leads to cognitive rigidity. You start organizing thoughts in pre-approved patterns. You avoid ideas that conflict with your internal schema, not because you fear being wrong, but because your mind is structured to resolve, not to investigate. You don't explore contradictions, you eliminate them. The result is stability. But that stability isn't neutral. It's limiting. You develop a low tolerance for uncertainty in relationships. You need people to be consistent, predictable, and legible. If someone sends mixed signals, you demand clarification. If they can't give it, you leave. You treat emotional ambiguity as a logistical risk, not as a relational reality. You develop the same intolerance in decision-making. You want outcomes to be modeled before they're experienced. You want proof before engagement. You want the process to be validated in advance. This reduces mistakes, but it also removes the possibility of surprise. Eventually, the world begins to feel overly defined, not because it is, but because you've filtered out everything that wasn't. You have no space for things that evolve. You have no patience for things that don't present their purpose immediately. You stop experimenting. You stop drifting. You stop sitting with things that feel contradictory. And you stop growing. Because real growth doesn't happen through confirmation. It happens through friction. And you've removed all friction in the name of clarity. The system you've built works. You are respected. You are trusted. You are rarely caught off guard. But the cost is the part of your mind that once found value in ambiguity. You no longer reflect. You summarize. You no longer question. You explain. You no longer engage in dialogue. You deliver conclusions. And now you've become incompatible with the world as it actually is. A world where answers are provisional. A world where emotion resists classification. A world where people contradict themselves daily. You see this, but instead of adjusting, you withdraw. You stay in environments you can control. You avoid conversations that can't be closed. You limit exposure to complexity. And this protects you, but it also isolates you. Because what you've trained yourself to avoid is not uncertainty. It's reality. You became so focused on being balanced that you lost access to anything extreme. In systems that reward regulation and composure, balance becomes a defining ideal. To be well-adjusted, emotionally stable, professionally measured, socially appropriate, this is presented as maturity. The idea is that strong reactions are immature, Overcommitment is unhealthy, and extremes are evidence of dysfunction. The closer one is to neutrality, the more evolved they appear. This framework encourages the flattening of emotion. Joy is moderated. Anger is controlled. Sadness is reframed. Even enthusiasm is tempered. You learn to function in the middle range. You become consistent, predictable, less volatile, less reactive. And this shift is praised. People trust you more. You experience fewer interpersonal breakdowns, fewer impulsive decisions. You make better plans, fewer mistakes. But what isn't discussed is what gets removed in the process. You lose access to intensity. You lose access to the part of you that once felt without restraint, that once cared without caution, that once believed in something with your entire focus, even if it didn't make sense, that once tried, not because the odds were good, but because you wanted to. That part isn't eliminated. It's just shelved. You tell yourself it's still there. But when you reach for it, it doesn't respond. Because you haven't practiced accessing it in years. You stopped chasing things without a clear path. You stopped saying things that couldn't be defended. You stopped doing things you couldn't explain. You stopped feeling things that didn't fit the framework of regulation. Over time, you reduced emotional variance in the name of self-management. You lowered the ceiling and the floor so nothing could hurt you too much or move you too far. And it worked. You became resilient, but not passionate. You became stable, but not animated. You became functional, but no longer fully engaged. You forgot how to burn for something, because burning is messy. It can't be contained. It creates risk. You forgot how to grieve fully, because grief doesn't resolve quickly. It doesn't follow schedules. It can't be monitored. You forgot how to love without strategy, because love, when real, overrides composure. And you've trained yourself to stay composed at all times. This pattern wasn't forced on you. It was chosen, piece by piece. Every time you felt something strongly and questioned whether it was appropriate. Every time you reframed discomfort into insight before it had finished being pain. Every time you neutralized yourself to avoid destabilizing others. Eventually, balance became your only emotional setting. And now you don't know how to tolerate anything that feels disproportionate. You avoid people who cry too much, who care too quickly, who change too often. Not because you dislike them, but because their intensity reminds you of what you buried. You avoid content that isn't moderated, that doesn't give you space to analyze, that doesn't offer closure. You avoid your own impulses, your own memories, your own irrational desires, because they don't fit the version of you that you've taught yourself to be. You tell yourself you're avoiding drama. What you're actually avoiding is contact with the full range of your humanity. You made yourself emotionally efficient, and now you don't know how to actually feel. Emotional efficiency is rarely discussed directly, but in high-performance environments, it's assumed. You learn to streamline reactions, filter impulses, compress your feelings into manageable expressions. You don't explode. You articulate. You don't break down. You reframe. You don't panic. You pivot. Over time, this becomes not just a skill, but a baseline expectation. It begins with necessity. You're in situations where emotion is inconvenient. Deadlines, pressure, group dynamics. There's no room for personal upheaval. So you manage it. You shorten your recovery time. You regulate outward displays. You learn to compartmentalize. You hold the breakdown for later, if later ever comes. This works. People around you feel safer. You're seen as reliable. You become the person who never overreacts, who can be trusted to stay calm under pressure. You build a reputation for being composed, mature, grounded. But what no one sees is what that process removes. You start to avoid the parts of emotion that don't respond to logic, the ones that take time, the ones that make no immediate sense, the ones that refuse to resolve on schedule. These emotions, grief, longing, confusion, become threats to your internal system. So you don't process them. You reduce them. You start describing how you feel, instead of actually feeling it. You frame sadness as burnout. You interpret anger as stress. You explain fear as overthinking. This language helps you function, but it distances you from your own experience. Eventually, emotional response becomes performance. You know what to say. You know how to present vulnerability in a way that still feels safe. You know how to disclose discomfort without sounding unstable. But inside, you're not experiencing the emotion. You're narrating it. The split gets wider. Your external language is expressive, but your internal world is muted. Everything you feel is filtered first through a question. Is this useful? Is this appropriate? Is this manageable? If the answer is no, you move on, not because the feeling resolved, but because it didn't meet the criteria. This habit generalizes. You stop allowing yourself to cry unless you understand the reason. You stop feeling joy unless you can justify the cause. You stop acknowledging desire unless it aligns with your goals. Eventually, you no longer trust raw emotional input. You assume it's distorted, irrational, needing immediate correction. And in doing so, you lose contact with the original signal. This doesn't look like dysfunction. It looks like control. You appear emotionally intelligent, but what you've really become is emotionally inaccessible to others and to yourself.